Okay. And so at the Center for Research on Families, we have various methodology offerings that we try to give, and we actually respond to the needs that come to us as well. So we've gotten a lot of questions from community organizations about whether we can help them with their program evaluation. And the answer is generally, we would love to help you, but we don't know what we're doing. It's not our wheelhouse, it's not our area of expertise. But it turns out that we have an alumni of the SURF Methods team who's going to help us today learn more about program evaluation. And she's got so much hands-on experience, and is also just a delightful old friend I'm glad to see again, to tell us about kind of some of the fundamentals, but also get us thinking about how we might apply evaluation to our own work. So Lindsay Demers is going to take it from here. I forgot to just quickly introduce Amanda in case any technical support is needed. So Amanda, you want to say hi real quick? This is Amanda Moore.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. And we're really excited to be able to share this content with you. So you should have received an email that contains a link to access the workshop, which you are in. So that means you got that, but you should also have a link to access the materials. So if you did not receive that, you can send me an email or drop it in the chat, and I'll be sure to forward that on to you. And then after the workshop today, or the seminar today, probably by tomorrow, you'll receive an email that has the recording, and then it also contains a survey so that you can share your feedback about the seminar with us, and we'd love to hear from you. And we'll also share some additional materials at that time that Lindsay will make available. So if you have any technical questions or anything about, payment processing or receipts or anything like that, I can definitely help you with that. So feel free to reach out and enjoy, and we're happy to have you. Thanks so much for coming.
Thanks, Amanda.
Thank you so much, Holly and Amanda. Is there anything else before I get started?
That's good. We're so excited.
So my name is Lindsay Demers. I'm an alumni of UMass. I got my PhD there just about 10 years ago, almost exactly. And since that time, I've worked exclusively in evaluation. So my first role after grad school was at a nonprofit, and I worked in the STEM Education Evaluation Center. So I did all evaluation of STEM curricula and different interventions to teach STEM, which is science, technology, engineering, and math, if you don't know. I did that for about 5 years. It was all soft money. And so through that, I gained a lot of different evaluation experiences, which I will talk more about. The next role I had was in a corporate job. I'll talk more about my corporate job at the Thursday seminar, I think. But that was still an evaluation. It was actually in energy efficiency evaluation. So it's the evaluation of programs designed to reduce electricity use and things like that. So like way out there. I was more there for the data science side than the evaluation side. I didn't like working in corporate. And so I was there for about a year, and for about 6 months of the year I was there, I was applying for a faculty job at BU, which is the role I'm in now. So at the BU Medical School, I'm the Director of Education Evaluation and the Director of Faculty Development and Diversity. And so again, through that, I've pretty much at this point worked on hundreds of evaluations, all with varying levels of my involvement. So sometimes when you're an evaluator, depending on who the client for whom you're doing the evaluation is, sometimes it's as simple as they give you their data, you analyze their data, and you send them the output. Sometimes it's more like being a stats consultant. But then at the other end of the spectrum, sometimes you have people who need to do an evaluation and they've never done a study in their life. So so they really have kind of it's not that they don't have any idea what they're doing. It's just they don't have the training to know how to necessarily properly evaluate things. And so in those circumstances, I essentially function as a PI, basically kind of, organizing all the research and kind of calling many of the shots. I do have, and then sometimes it's right in the middle, right? Sometimes it's right in the middle where the people that you're doing the evaluation for kind of know enough about research and have enough of an idea, but you're the one implementing the actual evaluation. And so a lot of times people will wonder like how does evaluation differ from research? And kind of, if you're going in and you're just analyzing data, like, isn't that just research? And the answer is yes. So all evaluation is research, but not all research is evaluation. Evaluation is a specific type of research designed to help you understand if a program, intervention, curriculum, whatever it is working as intended. So it's a very specific type of research question. Other than that, it doesn't really differ from research. It's very similar in terms of what you're trying to do, right? You're just trying to answer a research question. So if you imagine like a big circle that's all of research methods, evaluation is just like a little subcircle of all the research methods that you could do. People also are often interested in knowing how evaluation methods differ from traditional research methods. We're going to get a chance to kind of do exactly that in the second part of the workshop, or not necessarily the second half, but once we get through this kind of little didactic portion, what we're going to do is we're going to do what I'm calling an evaluation simulation. And so for that, I'm going to ask that you do put your cameras on, or I know I'm the worst person ever. Maybe put your cameras on, or at least be willing to contribute through the chat, because that portion is really going to rely on you all kind of participating and thinking. And I think through doing that, you start to realize the kind of concessions you have to make when you're doing evaluation, and kind of what tough decisions you have to make. So we'll get into kind of the nitty gritty about it during that time. And so I'll answer this question now, but I think by the end of this session, you'll have a much greater, thank you, a much better idea of how research methods and evaluation methods differ. The short answer is, when you're doing an evaluation, you have control over almost nothing. So if you're a PI doing a study, you might think, oh, I have this research question, so I'm going to do a power analysis, figure out how many people I need in my study. I'm going to recruit, I'm going to do, and like you have your druthers, I guess. You don't always, but to some extent, you can make these decisions to set up the circumstances so that you can cleanly answer your research question. The ability to cleanly answer a research question almost always goes out the window when you move to evaluation. And it's because you don't have that control. Oftentimes you don't have a say on what your sample size is going to be. It's just like, we have 30 people or we have 300 people, whatever it is. You don't get to necessarily say. You can make recommendations. I always recommend that people get more data, more people, so we have better power, but a lot of times that's just not possible. So basically what you're tasked with when you're doing an evaluation is you're still trying to hit that gold standard of research methods, where, you know, an RCT, right, in randomized control trial is the gold standard. You're still kind of aiming for that, but because you don't have the control, you have to make so many concessions and kind of balance the realities of the thing you're evaluating with research rigor. And it's often in this balance where I feel people feel most uneasy, because what you might consider evidence is not necessarily the same as the people who you're working with, particularly if they don't have a research background. We'll talk a little bit more about like the client-facing portion of evaluation during the simulation. Are there any questions so far about the difference between research and evaluation, or specific questions you brought that you'd like answered? Okay. So the next question I get a lot is, are evaluations publishable? Oh yeah, Christine.
Sorry, I'm a little slow.
No, eat lunch, enjoy.
So the one question that I have is, I'm extension faculty. And so that means that a lot of the outreach and things that we do, our stakeholders would love to know, is it effective? Are we reaching people? Are we changing behaviors? Are we changing policies? Are we changing knowledge? You know, these sort of key buzzwords. And so if you can address that at all in your in the workshop, that would be really fantastic.
Oh yes, absolutely. So one thing, I'll give a little spoiler. One thing I struggle with a lot is people always want to be able to make causal claims in their evaluation. And it's rare that you ever can, right? Because to make causal claims, you have to have randomized control trial or experimental design of some kind. And so, yeah, so that's a big problem. And managing the expectations of the person that you're doing the evaluation for is honestly one of the biggest things that we're going to talk about today, because I think that honestly, for me, over the last 10 years, this is where I've had the most amount of trouble is kind of like the marriage between what I know counts as evidence and what I think counts as evidence and what they think counts as evidence. And it's not always the same. And so we will certainly tackle some of that. And as we get there, I think that feel free to bring in any specific examples that you've dealt with once we get to that portion, because I think the more diversity we have in examples, the better we all will be.
Awesome, thank you.
Of course. Yeah, so this question about evaluations being publishable, the answer is yes. I mean, most of my publications are evaluations. So you certainly can publish them, and they don't need to be published necessarily in an evaluation journal. So of course there's like the there's AEA, it's like the American Evaluation Association. They have a journal, and that's really more for like evaluation methods, but certainly all the evaluations I do, I try to publish, and most of them are successful, but it's in content journals. So like, because I'm in medicine, it's like, you know, the Journal of General Internal Medicine, Journal of Graduate Medical Education. But I think certainly as long as the evaluation is well done as it can be, there's certainly room for you to publish it. The thing I would emphasize here is that unlike traditional scholarship, evaluation has many stakeholders in it usually, and we'll get into some of that during the simulation. But essentially, the authorship can become a real issue. So, right, say you have, you know, people that are working for a nonprofit, and then you have you who's maybe a faculty member and wants the publication. It kind of is an interesting question. Like if you're evaluating the thing that someone else developed, but you did all the research stuff, like really who, it's kind of a question for discussion over like who owns it really, like who has intellectual kind of ownership over that stuff. And so I would say yes, evaluations are absolutely publishable. You want to have authorship discussions up front and make it very clear, just because like I said, there's often a lot of stakeholders, and a lot of times they deserve to be authors. Sometimes people that don't deserve to be authors want to be authors. And so having those discussions up front and making it clear what every person will do, I mean, I think that's generally just good practice anyway. But certainly in evaluation, when you have sometimes competing organizations, you really want to make sure that if you are planning to publish, that you have clear discussions about that up front, just because it can save a lot of time later. But yeah, in and of themselves, there's no reason why evaluations can't be published. Well, there is a reason, and it's if it's a bad evaluation, but that's true of any research, right? Like if you do a bad study, it's not going to get published.
I don't know if I made this up or not, but I guess I feel like I worked with somebody who said that they hadn't asked for, they were allowed to collect data in an evaluation capacity, but they couldn't use it for publications or research because they hadn't gotten an IRB prior to data collection or something like that. Have you run into that problem? Am I making this up?
Nope, I run into that problem all the time. Fortunately, our IRB lets us do retroactive. So what usually happens is there's people that do something and they collect data, but they don't do an IRB. And obviously to publish, you have to have that line that's like, it was deemed exempt by the IRB or whatever language you use. Usually what I do in those cases is I do a retrospective one. And I usually say that we just collected the data for quality improvement to see if something was working, but then something interesting came out and we want to publish it. And so I think most IRBs have an option for retroactive. Right. Approval or it's like retroactive, it's usually exempt, right? Exempt research. So it's usually like a retroactive designation. But I tell people it's so easy to just, I mean, right, no IRBs are the same. Some are really easy about stuff like the exempt research. Some are more strict. I think if I remember correctly, the UMass one is pretty strict. But I think the thing is, if all else fails, just, and you're thinking about it, just get the IRB. It takes a little bit of time up front, but then you just have your bases covered if you decide you want to publish. And it can be a little tricky because it's like, if the thing you're evaluating is housed at another institution, it can get a little messy in terms of IRB, because if you're just the one like analyzing the de-identified data, then it's no big deal. But if you're collecting data, or you're like, it can get a little messy. So certainly, particularly around publishing, you really want to know if that's a goal of your stakeholders, because you will want to get that IRB, just get it done. Yeah,
it's helpful to know that you found a retroactive way, though, because I do think that the order of operations is often,
yes,
we included questionnaires at the last minute. Maybe they weren't the best questionnaires, but yeah, it was for quality improvement. But now we want to go further with it because we think our program is awesome.
right.
So it's really helpful to know that you've had success getting IRB approval retroactively.
Yeah, I mean, the worst thing that happens is you get a letter from the IRB saying you violated institutional policy, which usually terrifies people. But I'm like, I've been in IRB jail for years now. It's fine. I'm still pretty ethical. But yeah, it's definitely one of those things. You can get it retroactive, but I always tell people, like, for an exempt project, it's usually such a light lift. My hope, like, that it's usually worth getting. Any other questions about publishing evaluations? And like I said, some of the stuff will become much more concrete as we work through the example, but any questions right now? Okay. And then this last question is, what are some common issues you may encounter as an evaluator, and how do you overcome them? So I've touched on some of them already. One of the biggest, hardest things about being an evaluator, in my opinion, is I always call myself the bad news bearer because a lot of times in evaluation, things don't work out. A lot of times things are underpowered, or, as is the case in education evaluation, educational statistical effects tend to be small, right? So if you think about like a kid in a classroom that's getting some intervention, their home life, like the R square of that intervention is probably a tiny drop in the bucket compared to all the other things they're contending with. And that is no different as you get into medical school. Like, in general, just effect sizes in education tend to be small. And so a lot of times there are no results, and it's not all, I mean, I've done a lot of like post hoc power analyses to say, oh, look, this is, you estimate the effect size from your data, and then you can plug it in and say, oh, if we'd only had 2,000 people, this would have been significant. It's like, yeah, so kind of, I've moved a lot, specifically in medicine, to thinking more in terms of like, kind of not clinical significance, because that means something specific, but just kind of like, all right, this might not have been statistically significant, but now we have like 10 more residents who know how to do this skill. And so at the end of the day, it's still kind of a win because they're being taught something, but it's a real bummer to deliver that news sometimes, and it can be really hard, and you can get a lot of pressure put on you to do things a different way to make things look different, depending on the stakes. And that's something that is really hard. And I always joke, I'm like, all of a sudden when you have null results, suddenly everyone's a methodologist and knows everything about research, and they want to know why you did this test and why you did that. And it's like, it's one of those things, and it makes sense because the people that developed the thing you're evaluating, it's like usually their baby. It's something they invested a lot of time and effort in, and they really believe in it. And what often happens too is they have a lot of anecdotal data that it's working. And so to them, particularly if they're not trained in research, it's very hard to say that it's something isn't working in the face of anecdotal data. When someone doesn't necessarily understand, that anecdotal data isn't necessarily, meaningful, and that, how the data were collected matters. And that, if the only people, of course, if you're the inventor or the creator of something, no one's going to go up to you and be like, wow, that thing you made really sucks. Right? No one's going to say that. And so you end up having the person with like this really biased sense of how something works because they've only ever gotten good anecdotal feedback. And so then you come in with your fancy research methods and you're like, actually, this isn't working the way you think it is, or like it can be very devastating to them. And it can be then hard on you because you know, it's really hard. I think not a lot of people talk about that side of evaluation, but it can really take a toll. And so my advice in that arena is, well, we'll talk more about this again when we get to the simulation, but it really is just like appreciating that that person is probably going to be upset. And understanding why, but then also trying to, you know, explain the research side of things. And it's like, well, here's why you thought that, and like, here's what's actually going on in the data. And it can be hard. But then on the flip side, you'll never have a best friend like the one you have when you tell them that their thing does work. So people like it, so you do get to deliver good news sometimes. And that's really nice because people, you know, it's just nice validation, I think, of their experience. But it isn't always the case. And so setting people up, and again, this goes back to managing expectations, which we're going to talk much more about, but really setting people up to understand what counts as evidence and what doesn't count as evidence. And you know, having frank discussions about, you know, why things might not be working and what you could do. I always frame evaluation, particularly if it's the first time the thing has been evaluated, as really opportunities to make the program better, right? So you might think something's working really well as the developer of it, and then you might find out that it doesn't work as well as you thought. But then the next step, it's not just over. It's like, well, okay, it's not working as well as you thought. Let's take a look at the data, or let's collect some data to try to figure out why that is. And so one thing I'm going to really impart upon you is data that you should collect during the evaluation to save your butt later on. A lot of what you do as an evaluator is setting things up so that you have a lot of data so that you can give your stakeholders some useful information, even in the face of null results. And that can be hard to do, you know, especially a lot of times I feel like when you're trained in experimental psychology or just in traditional research, it's like, it's a null finding, like, gotta change my question. And a lot of times, like, the null finding is just the beginning, because then you have to kind of do lots of additional data collection to figure out like how the program could be improved, what can make it more effective. And then you want to do another evaluation. So I try to impress upon people that evaluation is iterative, it's cyclical. You go through, you get more data, you learn, you make changes, you get more data, you learn, you make changes. And a lot of times people want it to be like, oh, the thing I've made is perfect. Everyone tells me it's perfect. I can't wait for you to see how perfect it is. And it's a far fall to go from thinking that to not having any significant results. And I think that that's like truly one of the biggest challenges. I think another challenge is, and I apologize if you see kittens running in front of me. I'm gonna act like they're not there. Another challenge certainly is kind of, there can be power struggles. And I mean that because when we talk about, we're going to talk a lot about stakeholders, but what you want to do and what you think is best, a lot of times is going to just get shot down. And it can feel frustrating, like, you know, they're not respecting my expertise or something like that. But really what it is they're just very protective of the thing they developed. And so for that reason, it's really important. It's almost like, I mean, it's not, but it's similar to being like a grief counselor, I feel like, in a way, because you really have to set up and manage these expectations and make sure that you know clearly what your role is and what is expected of you. And that can be kind of good to set up front, but probably something you'll need to revisit as the evaluation goes. So like, who are people defaulting to? Are they defaulting to you as the evaluator? Or are they defaulting to like, we'll just call the person the PI, which would be the key stakeholder whose thing you're evaluating. So right, oftentimes as the evaluator, you're not the PI. Like you might be a co-PI if it's like a grant situation, but almost always you're not, you're someone separate. And that's with good reason, right? Because the person that developed the thing shouldn't also be the one that's deciding if the thing works, right? Everyone is biased. And so it's best to have an outside person come in. But then what happens when you have the outside person come in is, like I said, there can be a power struggle. It changes the dynamic. And so really being sensitive to what the pre-existing dynamics are among the PI or PIs can be really important. And also understanding what their research background is can be really, really important. We're going to talk more about that during the simulation as well, but certainly knowing what the backgrounds of your PIs are, if they've published before, or if this is their like first, a lot of that stuff really is going to matter for how you handle things down the road. But like I said, we'll have some concrete examples and discussion about that when we go through the simulation. So this is just kind of my like dump of information, just to kind of, these are questions I often get. Now I want to take a few minutes and just open the floor before we get into the simulation, which will take a little bit of time, to answer any questions that I haven't answered or that you just thought of or anything. So I'm just going to open the floor for a few minutes.
I have one question because this is completely new to me, and personally haven't done any of evaluation to any kind of programs. And I kind of wonder at what point do people usually bring in like outside or inside evaluators to start evaluating their programs? Like, is it during the implement or after? Like,
that's a good question. So ideally it's before, right? So like in an ideal world, it's before, and you can set things up the way you want them to be set up, or that you think they should best be set up. And that's the ideal model, but you bring up a very good point, which is that it doesn't always work that way for various reasons. So for example, when I started at my job at BU, they had a whole like years of data that people had collected, and they just meet with me and they're like, yeah, I didn't know what I was doing, but like, here's what I have. And in those situations, you know, there's not really much you can do. If they have, sometimes people happen to just do a good job and like, you're like, oh, this is great. Like but a lot of times that's not the case, but they did the best they can. And so what I like to do in those situations is, if there's no room to collect additional data, what I usually do is sit with the person and explain to them where there are some gaps. So this was, I mean, often a lot of times they're like, I know this is crap. Like, you can just tell me how crappy it is. Like the people I work with have no, I mean, they're all almost all medical doctors. And so they're not trained in research. So they're very smart people that don't know much about research. So they usually do a decently good job, but like, then they want to publish it. And I'm like, so when it happens like that, what I usually tell people, and again, this just goes back to managing expectations. The best outcome from that, if they don't have data that are usable, is really to just make that an opportunity for some light education about what you would need to have done to have had the data be a bit more rigorous. Yeah, because it does happen sometimes or sometimes you'll just get like a data file sent to you, and the person will think that they've helped you by color coding it all and doing all of this stuff. And it's like, no, the more boring the spreadsheet, the more I like it. But really kind of just in those cases, making sure that you know exactly what they collected and making sure you can manage their expectations is really important, because ideally it should be done at the beginning. And honestly, if someone came to me and they were like, we need to do an evaluation, but we haven't done anything, it's going to come down to money, basically. And we're going to talk about how to budget for an evaluation as well. This is going to be a very concrete workshop. Once we kind of get through these. But yeah, I mean, it does happen. And a lot of times your hands are tied. And so you just try your best to make lemonade out of the lemons you're given. But, you know, the lemonade doesn't taste as sweet when you don't make it from scratch. Other
Great, thank you.
questions? Yeah. Yeah, Megan.
I have kind of a related question to that one. I'm also new to evaluation research and I'm right at the beginning of a project. So I just received a public service endowment grant where I'm collaborating with a community organization to do a parent outreach program. And I am here because I want to figure out the best way to evaluate it. And so I'm wondering kind of who would be an appropriate person to bring in, like someone from UMass or someone from the community, and kind of maybe you'll get to this later, but how you decide who to ask to help evaluate your program.
So I mean, so this is the side that I'm never on because I'm always the person that gets asked to do them. But I think what I would look for is someone, what I would do is ask for references from people you're considering. Because I mean, you might do that anyway, but I think someone that has a PhD is always good. Not people without PhD. I mean, there's plenty of master's level people who can do good evaluation. You don't have to have a PhD. But I think that depending on the complexity, having a PhD might be better just because there might be instances where you have to kind of do some sophisticated statistical work to get clear answers. And so that can be helpful. So I think knowing what the evaluation goals are first and foremost, and then finding someone whose skill set aligns with those goals. So like if it's a really small sample size and you're going to be doing a lot of qualitative data collection, I'm probably not going to be your best person, right? But so I think really looking at the types of evaluations people have done, and finding people who have good, like, you know, good kind of references or recommendations or whatever, but that someone that's closely aligned with what you're doing. So like having experience in a particular realm does make you a much better evaluator in it. So like I did a lot of classroom evaluation and I had never been an elementary school teacher, but now I know a lot about how elementary schools work because I had to learn to do research in them. And so just by virtue of having been in schools for so many years, I'm like, oh, this is going to be an issue, or that's probably going to be an issue. And you start to learn what questions you should ask up front, which again, we'll talk about. But yeah, I think when you're looking for an evaluator, looking for someone that is in that obviously has the research and evaluation experience, but then if you're choosing between two people who have equally good kind of credentials, I would go with the one that has done similar, that has worked in similar spheres before. Just because, yeah, there's a lot of like just kind of tacit knowledge that you pick up and that makes your evaluations a bit better, I think. Other questions? Okay. So what we're going to do now is we're going to dive into the evaluation simulation. And I think that this is where we'll probably get the most bang for our buck. And I think where you'll get a lot of, you'll see, I think realistically, what kind of decisions you have to make and concessions you have to make. So I'm just going to stop sharing for a second. And I'm going to open. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open the simulation thing and I'm just going to have you read this intro. Please tell me if you need me to make it bigger. I'll make it a skosh bigger. Okay, so just take a few minutes to read this. Okay. So you all had, this was in the box folder, this description. And this is not necessarily, I mean, we're not gonna like, you'll just suspend disbelief and pretend this is a good idea. There's a lot of logistic things that, but we're gonna pretend that this is what they're doing. And honestly, sometimes you do get asked to evaluate things and you're like, how is that gonna work? And it's like, yeah, don't worry about it. It's not your problem to implement it. It's just your problem to track implementation, right? Okay. So does anyone first have any questions about this setup? Okay. I would say if you have it downloaded, you might want to open it up so you have it on your screen so you can refer back to it as we work through the questions. Okay, so the first thing is we need to establish our evaluation goals. The first thing you want to ask as you're establishing the goals are who are your key stakeholders? So in this example, who do you think the key stakeholders would be?
In the chat, we've got a couple of.
I'll open the chat up so you can see it. Yes. So the school administration is the big one, right? Because they're spending the money to find out if it works. The students, certainly, because if you don't have the students buying into it, it's not going to work. So they're a key stakeholder, but not necessarily in the traditional way you'd think. They're a key stakeholder because you absolutely need their buy-in. And the nonprofit, right? Because if you developed a program that's being implemented, they're going to want to know if it works. They're going to want to see results for their own efficacy, right? So you have here the administrators of the school, exactly. So school administrators, you might also have school committee members. So if like, and again, or like PTO members. So if anyone that's in charge of, yes, parents, that's another great one. Anyone that's in charge of deciding how money gets spent in the schools is gonna want to know, because this is not a little chunk of money. It's 150K, right? And so they're gonna want to see. So maybe the school board was like, no, we don't want to spend money on this, but you talk them, someone talks them into it. And then it's like, well, they're going to be really invested in it working. So you have a lot of people here. The parents, that's another great one, because they want their kids to be well. And particularly if their kids are, victims of bullying or the perpetuators of bullying, they clearly it all comes from some mental health struggles. And so figuring out what all the key stakeholders are can feel a little overwhelming. Oh yeah, school guidance counselors and other staff, like you have a lot hinging on the success or not of this program. So now in terms of the stakeholders, I'm just going to type it in here. We have school admins. We have parents, students, school committee, PTO. I mean, that's kind of parents, but it might be, other people in the community. But we have all of these people. We have we'll call it the CEO of the nonprofit, employees of the nonprofit. So say you're a counselor and you're going in, you might want to know, am I doing a good job? Is this working? Employees of the nonprofit. So you can see as you start to think about it, you have a lot of people who are gonna be invested in this evaluation. Sometimes I think having all these key stakeholders, it's worse than peer review, because at least with peer review, that the people reviewing it are people that are experts usually in the thing. Here, you're going to have people reviewing it, many of whom might not even have ever done anything to do with research. And yet you will need to come up with evidence that's compelling to them. And they don't understand statistics. And that's pretty common. So you have all of these key stakeholders. And then you might also want to consider yourself, the evaluator, particularly if you can't spell evaluator, particularly if you want to publish it or you're a faculty member. This is going to be a chunk of your time. Probably want some scholarship out of it. And again, we'll talk a little bit about like how to navigate that in a moment. But yeah, there's a lot of people here that you're going to need to try to please. And you know the saying, you can't please everybody. And so really understanding who the key stakeholders are and what stake they have is so important. So the school admins, the PTO, the school committee, their investment, I mean, obviously they want the positive outcomes for the students, but they're making a financial investment. Maybe they want to know, well, will investing this $150K mean fewer hours guidance counselors have to spend outside of school, or whatever it is? They want to know that they're making a good investment and they're going to get return on that investment. The parents might have different concerns, right? Like they're probably, you know, you're not just going to have like random parents, because a lot of parents, if you work in schools, you know, there's varying levels of checked inness with what's going on at the schools. But parents definitely, you know, if you're wanting students to take advantage of it, and you have parents that are like, well, therapy's stupid, or what, I don't know, whatever. You definitely want them to be on board, because ultimately you know, their children are the ones that are going to make the program sink or float. And so, you know, understanding what kind of help they'll be exposed to, things like that could be important. Same with students. Again, if you don't have students, you don't have a program. Middle school students are probably the hardest. So we'll talk a little bit about that side of things soon. And then you have the CEO of the nonprofit, who their stake is that they really want their program to be successful and work. If, you know, the school pays $150K for it and they don't see any change, well, then that, you know, isn't good for the nonprofit because they're, you know, they just lost a chunk of money, and they probably won't get asked back to do anything again. And so there really is a lot of pressure on you, the evaluator, to please a lot of people. And so this is where that kind of, like I mentioned, the customer service side of evaluation has to come out. So unlike with other traditional research, you can just be like, you can be a little bit more, not cutthroat, but just kind of like blunt and like, okay, this didn't work, I'm moving on. In this case, that ain't gonna fly. You need, like, when something doesn't work, you need to say potentially why you think it's not working. It's not just like, oh, it's null, shut SPSS or whatever and be done for the day. So you really have to have an understanding of who the key stakeholders are. And then the next thing you want to think about, and we're going to spend a lot of time talking about this, but at a very high level, I would love to hear from you in the chat, or you can chime in vocally. What are key outcomes you think you need to assess to know if this has worked? And again, we'll talk right now at a very high level, and then we'll get into the nitty-gritty a little bit later. So what do you think? How will you know if the program has worked? Yeah, so a measure of student well-being. And we'll talk, like I said, we'll talk about, well, how would you actually measure that soon? But student well-being is a great one.
You had fewer incidents of bullying.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. What else might you measure? The use of it, that's a great suggestion. So kind of uptake. Anything else? Yeah, that's a good one. And again, we're not, that's totally true. It could be hard to measure, but we're not thinking about realistic, which like what would be, you know, in measure conceptually. And so that's, so quality of interaction. Validity of the intervention.
Would you possibly in the design of it be able to gain some insight into some of these parameters by meeting with the students and learning about how school, what their experiences are in school. So these would be sort of emergent, I would think.
Yes. So actually, you're getting a little ahead of us, but that is absolutely. So I'll put here just kind of like, I'll kind of put it under this umbrella, but your point is very well taken, and we're going to come back to it about talking to students. So for now, we'll leave this list here. Like I said, we're going to, fidelity to delivery. Yeah, so certainly fidelity of implementation and participation. And so we'll talk more about those a little later when we talk about the specific measures and how we'd measure them. But yeah, if the program isn't being used, it can't be effective, right? So we need to look at how it's being implemented, if it's being implemented with fidelity. So it says that the counselors are always available before school. What if one of the counselors is always late? That's going to be a hiccup in your intervention that you need to document and take into account. So yes, so we'll spend quite a bit of time talking about fidelity of implementation and participation. But these overarching, I feel like this is a pretty good, like you're hitting on the main things of like what we'd want to look at to know if change has occurred. Whoops. I got a new computer, and every time I do anything, I do something that I'm not supposed to. So I have to like be careful. Okay. And now this is the hard question. And this is obviously more hypothetical and for discussion, but what does each of your key stakeholders consider compelling evidence? And how does that differ from what you consider compelling evidence? So for example, I did more in my career, a lot of work in schools, and they always wanted to compare their school's data to state averages or national averages. And to me, that's not a good comparison, right? There's lots of reasons. I mean, the first of which being that the state average you're comparing to includes your data point, which doesn't make sense, but lots of other reasons about like heterogeneity of variance, things like that. That's, here's the average and we're up here. It's like, that's not always the most compelling, but for a lot of school administrators, that is it. That is the thing that shows that it's working. And so it's really important at this stage for you. I would recommend doing informational interviews. You don't have to like call them formal interviews or anything, but having informational interviews with each of your key stakeholders to get an understanding of what they consider evidence. One of my biggest missteps as an early evaluator was I was like, well, I'm the expert. They brought me in. I decide what's evidence. No. I mean, you can decide, but it might not be what they think. And if you could give them, like, so I remember one, like this was, God, in 2012, someone had developed a survey and I was like, I can do a confirmatory factor analysis to see, if it's reliable and valid. And so I did that. And then the results didn't turn out how they wanted. And they were like, well, like what it gave them was not what they wanted. And I'm like, yeah, but this is better. And they don't care. And so you really need to take that time up front because one, it's going to make your life so much easier as an evaluator. And two, they'll be happier with your work. Even if you could have done something more rigorous, if they will not appreciate that added rigor, you really have to choose your battles. And so there are certainly times where I push back. And in those instances, I try to really, again, do some education and just explain, oh, well, we could do it this way, but then there are all these confounds that, we won't be able to rule out. And doing it this way, we can rule these things out. And so you really have to get pretty good at learning how to explain research concepts to people that don't have a research background and why it matters. So like, for example, I totally stole this from, what is that book? Written by economists. I forget, I'll think of it. Freakonomics, that's what it is. And they describe a control variable like a golf handicap. And so I kind of stole that and I'm like, that's how I describe it. I'm like, so, not all these kids come from the same types of homes. Some kids have more of an advantage because they come from higher SES homes. So so we introduced the idea of like a golf handicap. Now, some people start off ahead and you want to kind of take that into account. It's not the best explanation, but you're gonna lose some technical correctness in favor of them just understanding the concept. And as long as they understand the concept, that's fine, because the technical side is your side anyway. But I can't emphasize enough how important it is to understand what they consider evidence. If they've done evaluations before, you might ask to see, oh, we had someone do an evaluation 5 years ago. You might ask to see the evaluation report, and then find out from them if they were happy with it or not, because that can also be helpful. Like if they're like, oh, look at this awesome graph, and it's just like their school compared to the state average, you're like, whoa, that's not compelling at all. But if that's what they want, to some extent, that's what you have to deliver, because at the end of the day, they're a paying client. Now, when it comes to publishing, obviously that's—
Sorry to interrupt. We have a question in the chat.
Oh, good, of course. So
Christine.
So we'll talk about that. Put a pin in that question. But yes, that could totally work, because you identify like a comparison school that has similar demographics. That could totally work.
Just building off of something you said, Lindsay, I also thought to myself, what if you get really clear on what your stakeholders consider compelling evidence, and you really know it's unlikely that you could find something with that? So for example, I'm thinking of the bullying incidents. That's a hard outcome, but it's also a low base rate outcome.
Yes.
And so how might you respond in your experience to somebody who said, this is the be all and end all, I want bullying to go down, I want incidents to go down, and that is the only outcome I care about? Like, how would you respond to that?
Yeah, and that does happen. Like they're like, this is all I care about. And so, in those instances, what I try to emphasize to them is that true change takes time. Regardless of what your intervention is, it takes time. And so, and there are many steps along the way before bullying goes down, right? So you're going to see first, as someone mentioned, maybe perhaps better, well-being in students. That might start to change before the bullying changes. And so in those instances, I try to get people to really think about it's like there's like this thing and I want it to go down. And it's like, but you have to think of the nuance. What are all the things that need to happen for actual changes and observable bullying to change?
And then make sure you're measuring those as well.
Exactly right.
Okay.
That's exactly right.
That's very helpful.
So this is also, at this point, when you're talking about considering compelling evidence, this is a good time to talk about if they're going to want to publish. A lot of times people don't care about publishing. In my current job, people care a lot about publishing. So almost all the evaluations we do are published. But if you're working with a community stakeholder, they may or may not care. And so it's really up to you to decide. So if you don't want to publish, then you're in this position where it's like, well, I can do kind of a maybe crappy study, and I think it's kind of crappy and non-conclusive, but they love it, and that doesn't feel really good. It kind of feels like a waste of you as a resource. And so in those instances, and then the other side, if they want to publish, then it's much easier to convince them to do the more rigorous thing, because they want to get published. And so in those cases, it's much easier. But when you have people that, and I think this is the norm, aren't super into research, aren't super into publishing, but they were told by a funder they need to do an evaluation, or they were told they need to do it. So sometimes they don't even want you there. And then not only that, they don't necessarily want you there. And then you're making their lives much harder by saying, well, you should do this, and you should do this, and you should collect this. And so it's really important just to have these conversations and to really meet people where they're at. And I think that honestly, if you're able to do that, then that just sets a nice tone for the rest of the evaluation. Any questions about kind of it's really kind of like a bit messy, and I think every situation is idiosyncratic. But any situations like this that people have been in, or questions you have about this that we could talk through? Okay. So then what you want to consider then, once you kind of have done these informational interviews, What you then want to consider is the gap. And the gap it calls what you would consider evidence versus what they consider evidence. Sometimes what they consider evidence, they're kind of here, but a lot of times they're far apart. And unfortunately, to get more compelling evidence, it usually requires more work and more money, which no one ever wants to do. And so we'll talk a little bit as when we get to the budgeting section about how we would actually, we're going to work through much more. We'll talk about how we'd actually budget it out. A lot of times, the decisions you make at this point are going to be guided to some extent by what you think, but also by budgetary limitations. So you might think, oh, there's a great way we could measure this. We could like film the interactions and then code that. And it's like that you theoretically could do it. And if you were a PI in a study, you could design a study to do that. But in this situation, you're not. And so really thinking about, we'll talk about kind of like feasibility as we go through. But this is usually how I start. Very high level, like, okay, what would like practically change if this intervention was effective? I don't worry about how I'd measure it yet, just like what would be changed and what do other people consider change? What will they believe? What will they need to see to know that the thing is or isn't working? And you just have to prepare for the fact it's probably not going to be the same as what you think. And a lot of times if they disagree with you, they'll say, okay, but we're not giving you money to do that. So you have to do something else. And so really this is also where that kind of the difference between research and evaluation is so obvious, is it's because you don't have that much control. You're doing the best, but people want very good evidence. So you get almost no resources, but you're expected to produce causal claims. And so it can be, it can be really tough, but I think starting off with these conversations can kind of head off disappointment in stakeholders, confusion in stakeholders. I even sometimes go as far as to tell them, I mean, obviously this is a little further on, but like here's the most you'll be able to claim when I'm done. Like, you're not going to be able to make causal claims. Like, I try to set them up at the beginning for like, this is the most that you'll be able to say. And sometimes they don't like it, but I think the thing is, like, if someone else is promising that they can deliver causal claims, they're not going to be able to. And so just reassuring people that you know what you're doing is important, and that you understand their goals and that they're important to you. But that you have to do things in a way that is aligned with your training, and that is that is would be considered evidence to someone outside of the key stakeholders, right? Because a lot of times the stakeholders are kind of like in their own little bubble, and like if you showed it to someone else, it'd be like, huh? And so you want something that's compelling to outside people, and that usually helps kind of it sink in as well, when it's like, okay, this is how would someone else feel if they saw this change? Would they be convinced that the program worked? If the answer is no, then that kind of tells you what you need to know. But yeah, I can't emphasize enough, scheduling these individual interviews, potentially one-on-one, is the best thing, I think. Any questions about how you'd go about conducting those interviews or anything like that before we move on? Yep. Okay. So we're about an hour in. I think right now, so the next stuff we go through is going to be getting into the nitty gritty and getting into the weeds. So I think that now's a good time for us to break. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to stop sharing. I think they said a 15-minute break. And so we'll reconvene at 2:45. And then we'll start to get into some of these nitty-gritty questions about measurement and research design and things like that. So please enjoy, and I will see you in 15 minutes. Is everyone ready to get started? I'm going to reshare my screen. Okay, I'm just going to give like 30 seconds to make sure people have had time to get back, and then we're going to start getting into the nitty-gritty. In the meantime, are there any questions? No. Okay. All right. So up until this point, we've just been talking about evaluation, and I haven't differentiated between different types of evaluation. And so we're just going to take a minute here and pause and talk about the difference between formative and summative evaluation. Sometimes this is called process and outcome evaluation. Process and formative are the same thing, and outcome and summative are the same thing, essentially. I use the terms formative and summative just because that's how I learned it. As an evaluator, you need to collect both formative evaluation data as well as summative evaluation data. So what's the difference? Formative evaluation data is more about how the thing, whatever it is being implemented or used. I think of this as more, it's kind of more like babysitting evaluation. And I say that just because it's often doesn't require, like validated instruments and things like that. It's just like, how many people have used the thing? How many people showed up to the lecture series? How many students signed up for the counseling? And it's really about kind of how the thing is being implemented. And then your summative data are more about that kind of like big research question you're trying to answer. So in our case, the big summative question is, I don't want that bold. Does the implementation of the counseling program reduce bullying? That's the question that we ultimately need to answer. But as we talked about before the break, there are many things that need to happen in between the program being implemented and bullying actually going down. And for me, it's most helpful to think about what formative data I want to collect in relation to the summative question. So like Holly mentioned, sometimes people, I just want to know if bullying is going down. Like that's classic CEO behavior. Like they're just like, I want to know like 2 bullets, like just tell me. And so, and it's even true for a lot of like the clinicians I work with, super, super busy, like millions of patients, and they just want to know like the bottom line. But oftentimes it's not a clear yes or no answer. And this is another place where kind of the evaluation differs from research, is that you really have to contend with all of the real world circumstances and things that might mitigate the impact of the program. So thinking about our overall summative question, do folks have ideas about what formative data we'd want to collect? We've kind of hinted at some of this stuff already. Put another way, so say at the end, your results show that there was no reduction in bullying. What are possible explanations for that null result?
I think you'd want to know whether students are making use of the service, service is being offered. And if students are, who are those students? And what types of issues did those students actually refer in their counseling session? And were they making use of the sessions that were offered during class times? Or was there another format that was more used and sought out, for example?
Right. So certainly, one reason we might see a null effect is that students didn't use the services. You wouldn't expect a change if no change has been made because the students aren't going, right? So that's one big thing. You really want to look, and this is what we'd call fidelity of participation. You really want to look to make sure that students are using the services. So say you track that for a few weeks, and say you're thinking, this is how I think in advance. So say you're tracking it for 2 weeks and say you find out students aren't using it. What do you do?
Maybe talk to the students and find out why.
Yeah,
Like
exactly
what are their
right.
perceptions of it? I guess more of a qualitative question.
Exactly. What I would recommend at this stage is focus groups with students. And you may want to do this whether or not you might want to do it beforehand. You might want to do focus groups with students before the program is even introduced, because it might be helpful to know what kind of introduction students are going to be receptive to. If, the principal comes in and is like, you're all bullying, like, if it's kind of done in a punitive way, or not, or, comes from a different lens, the students may be less inclined to want to participate in it. And so it's really important to understand how you're going to get student buy-in. The best way to understand that is to talk to the students and maybe some teachers as well. Like, how do you think students will receive this? Do you think that they'll be reticent to like talk to a counselor because they're worried it's not really confidential? So really starting to get, and this really is something, in my opinion, that needs to be done qualitatively. You could do a survey, but the thing with the survey is the survey is limited to what the things you can think of, right? Like, so all the ideas that I have about why there might not be uptake of it, I'm not a student at the school. There could be important context there that's important. There could be, certain people who aren't viewed, as like a resource for students, and do we want them necessarily involved with it? And so it's really important to understand some of that messiness, because understanding it, one, is going to help you evaluate the program. Two, it's going to allow you to have some data. So when they say, well, look, only 20% of students are using it, and you can say, well, I talked to some students and these are the barriers we're seeing. They don't really believe it's confidential, would probably be a big one. They don't trust the counselors, or they don't, whatever it is. But finding out why they're not using it is going to be so important. So I might do a focus group up front to just start to get some of that information. What other things might we want to collect? So again, pretending, and this is usually how I decide what formative data collect. If there is a null result, what information will I want to have that might help explain it? So obviously students not using it. What are some other formative data we might want to collect?
I don't know how you'd figure this out, but I wonder if there's like a climate, just a school climate problem that's causing the bullying that really has nothing to do with counseling or not.
Yep. That's incredible. That's extremely possible too, right? A lot of times, like, this is again from the school administrators. They think bullying is the problem. Oh, and that's a good question. How is bullying measured? So we'll get to that in a second. But right, like maybe like there's just like a negative climate, and maybe it would be better if there were new administrators or something. You don't know, but I think first and foremost, it's going to be good to get a baseline for you, right? So maybe you find that the school climate is really negative, or maybe it's really positive, and that's going to kind of, to some extent, determine how you go in. So if you're feeling like you're walking into a really negative environment, I've had evaluations where I'm like, oh, I know what the problem is, it's you. Like, truly. And you obviously can't say that, but it's like it's like you get all the data and like all signs point to the principal's the problem, or so, like something like that. That does happen. But they think, so I don't know if you're familiar with Dunning-Kruger, but essentially it's this phenomenon wherein people don't know how much they don't know, essentially. And so they might think, no, I'm a cool hip principal, the students love me. Like, based on what? Like, right? And so it's really important as the evaluator to really try and see through a lot of those dynamics. And there's not a lot you can do about it, right? Like, you can go and be like, yeah, you're actually the problem, so we're going to get rid of you and not do an evaluation. But you can start to collect data in a way that starts to point to some things. I mean, it's hard without a specific example, and I don't want to use a real example, but it is very important to understand the kind of climate you're walking into, and how students feel about administration, how students feel about their teachers, how they feel about each other. Super helpful information to have as you're going in, and potentially could serve as a baseline measure. Because theoretically, if people are getting, mental health support, they're, doing better, maybe higher levels of well-being, you might expect that to be reflected in a better, more positive school climate at the end of the academic year. So getting data like this not only gives you a baseline comparison, but also gives you information about what you're really walking into. Because oftentimes what is presented to you is very biased, and it's only the key stakeholders who are presenting it to you. And I'm sure that you all can agree, the kind of lead people at organizations often aren't in tune with what's going on in them. I mean, not always, but I think of like the Ellen show. I don't know if you saw this controversy, right? But like all the staff was super unhappy, and how much she knew about it or not. But if you maybe asked Ellen, she'd be like, no, we have such a lovely collegial environment. And everyone was so shocked to hear that it was really toxic. So if you went based on the image Ellen portrayed, you'd be like, what? No. But then you get data, you talk to people and you're like, oh, this is a completely different situation than what I thought I was walking into. So that can be, and again, a lot of this can come out through focus groups with students, teachers, and these types of schools climate surveys. So really knowing the baseline you're walking into before the program is implemented is very important. So we'll talk a little bit about how bullying is measured. That's really more of a summative question. So I'll put a pin in that until we get to the summative part. But for now, we'll stick with the formative. So what are any other formative data you'd want to collect?
Maybe what existing mental health supports are already at the school and to what extent do students use them?
Mm-hmm. So that's a really great question. Maybe there are mental health supports and the students aren't using them, maybe because they don't want to go talk to a guidance counselor, or maybe there are reasons, and so finding out why there is an uptake of it is going to be super important for understanding the extent of fidelity of participation in the students. Such a good question. What else would people ask? What about thinking about student satisfaction with the counseling they're getting once they go? So maybe a student's having an issue and they make an appointment and they go to the counselor, and not all counselors are created equal. Maybe they have a bad experience. Or is that student likely to come back? Probably not. So getting, maybe brief satisfaction surveys from the students to understand, why they're not going. So or maybe they're really happy with it and they love the counselor and they keep coming back. That would be helpful to know. So I'll add to this, student satisfaction. And this is something maybe you'd have student fill out a brief survey, 2 or 3 questions on their phone after each appointment or something. So you'll see a lot of our formative data so far is coming from students. And this is why I think it's so important to consider students a key stakeholder in this example, because without them, you don't have a program. And so it's really important to consider these things and really put yourself in the shoes of the students and think about, like, why wouldn't they want to participate in this, or kind of what would their barriers be, and what could be implemented to help them overcome those barriers. So maybe the concern is, I don't think it's really confidential. Now, obviously, as we noted above, if someone's a danger to themselves or others, the same rules apply in all counseling, right? But maybe the students don't believe it's really confidential. Maybe they've had experiences where they don't trust authority for good reason. So in those situations, it would be really helpful to know, okay, we're really afraid it's not confidential. So then what can we do? Well, then maybe we can, put some systems in place to help ensure, or give the counselors some extra training on how to help them ensure that it is confidential. But knowing you can't address those things if you don't know them. And so finding out, and you can't assume what they are either. So you really need to just talk to people. What about other ideas for formative data? There's a lot of stuff you could potentially collect here.
I put this in the chat, but maybe teacher surveys as well.
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Or I don't know if this would still be formative, but like observing peer interactions during lunch or during recess.
Mm-hmm. That could be really powerful. And you're right, it does kind of bleed into the summative, but that's okay. Like these labels are just in place kind of like as a heuristic. Like the formative is more about like the process stuff, how it's implemented, etc. And the summative is really like, did it work? But it's completely appropriate that you have some things that answer both. That's totally fine. But yeah, teacher surveys, what kind of questions would we want to ask teachers?
Maybe like, are they concerned about bullying? What have they noticed during free time? And does that change once the program has started?
Mm-hmm. So maybe you want to have your teachers, and we don't want to put a lot of burden on the teachers. They already have enough burden, but maybe at the end of each month, they do a little survey. And maybe they comment on the climate in the classroom. Maybe they comment on the number of incidents they've had in the classroom where they've had, like behavioral incidents or whatever. And again, that's creeping a little into summative, and that's okay. Because what's nice is you get the formative data, so you get the real-time data as it's coming in. Oh, I mean, you can't conclude too much, like, right, just by looking on some numbers and, oh, it's going up, right? You can't, I mean, that's why statistics exist, because we can't eyeball meaningful change. But in this case, if you do see the number going in one direction or the other, it can give you some information on how things are working. And that could be really valuable. So if you have a teacher and the number of incidents that they are having in the classroom is going down each month, say, not only is that good formative data because it tells you that things are moving in the right direction, but then by the end of the year, you have 9 months of data from each teacher that you can then analyze for change over time. And so in that way, it's like this formative data where you're kind of doing like a half-baked, almost descriptive qualitative analysis where you're like, okay, it's going in the right direction, it's going in the right direction. And that's at least a sign that things are moving the way that they should be based on the intervention. So certainly surveying teachers could be important. What do people think about potentially getting data from the counselors?
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah.
So what kind of data might we want to collect from the counselors?
Well, what I think we're kind of discussing, we're doing it, but the whole idea, I went back to what you wrote in the document, and it said the program is intended to help destigmatize mental health challenges.
Mm-hmm.
So somehow grasping better what the counselors view currently as how stigmatization is appearing in the school community.
Mm-hmm. Right. So maybe in their conversations with administration, are the administration using outdated terms? Or they use, you know what I mean? Like, are they kind of like what are the counselors' view of how, the administration sees their presence? How do the guidance counselors feel about it? And right, if the teachers and the administration aren't fully bought in, that's a huge issue for us seeing bullying going down or not, right? Because if they're not bought into it, and so knowing from the counselors, like, yeah, like the vice principal really doesn't seem like he's really on board, like that kind of informal information is so invaluable, but you can't put that in a report, right? So then what you need to do is do some interviews or talk, because right, with an N of 3, you're not going to really want to do a survey because you can't really analyze it. But you can get some great information from an interview. And so it might be information that just obviously confidential. You're not going to put that in a report, but it can be really good information for like knowing where things might be going awry, right? And because what you need to do at the end of all this is put it into a package and share it with the stakeholders. Like, here's what's working and here's what's not. And knowing that, and you could say, school administration buy-in was an issue. Then you're not calling people out, but then you're saying, here's what some of the counselors observed. And obviously you've got to keep it at a really, high level so people aren't identified, but, knowing that is going to be really valuable. And this is where some of the evaluation stuff gets messy, because you're dealing with real people in a real school working with a real company. And so not everyone is always professional, and not everyone. And so you really have to kind of manage those dynamics. And the thing that I always tell people and tell myself daily is not to get wrapped up in it. So a lot of times you walk into things and there's pre-existing dynamics, and this person doesn't like that person, and you have to navigate that. And it can be challenging to navigate, but it can also be really challenging, more so when it's not just like an interpersonal thing, but like it's actually affecting the data. So this is a great question, Megan. So asking the counselors if they had sufficient support. Do counselors feel supported by administration? Are they welcome in the school? Right? That's a big factor. I would say the best way to do this, where you just have an N of 3, would probably be to do interviews or a focus group with the 3 of them. That would probably be the best way to do it. Obviously both qualitative and quantitative methods have their limitations, but I think in situations like this, where it's potentially personal data, it really is much better to just do it as an interview, especially if you can build rapport with those people, because they're going to be some of your key informants throughout the evaluation. And so you want to make sure you have a nice open relationship with them. Just because, right, you're ultimately all on the same team. And that's the thing that I always try to remind people when there are disagreements or people, I'm like, we're all on the same team here. We all have the same goal. So let's kind of reframe it that way. And then kind of, it tends to lead to a more productive conversation if you frame it in that way. But yeah, these are all real world things that happen. Like, you walk into these dynamics and you're like, what did I just walk into? And you have to make it work. And so this is just the reality of a lot of it. And so talking to the counselors is going to be super important, and making sure that they feel supported. Yeah, and I do think qualitative is the best way to do that. Any other people we should maybe talk to, get either through interview, survey?
I was going to say parents.
Yeah, so what would we maybe want to ask parents?
I guess maybe if their child has participated and what the parent thinks about the service that they were provided.
Right. So now this is an interesting thing though. What if it's confidential, kids, what if the problems the kids are having are at home? Then talking to parents, it could be very informative, but it could be a potential confidentiality issue. So I think that, but I do think it's important to talk to parents, because if there's a mental health stigma at home, that's going to, potentially be very impactful, more impactful than just having a counselor at your school. So I think, doing a survey of parents maybe, and just sending it out and saying, I guess technically the parents would need to consent to this, wouldn't they? I don't know about how all that stuff works, but let's pretend that they don't for the sake of this example. Getting a sense of, do they go to therapy? Do they like just kind of like, it would be a really invasive survey to ask that, but you potentially could. Another option would be to talk to the PTO, because there, you have parents who are super involved. And that might be another thing to kind of get, where you could get some potential buy-in. You also might get a lot of pushback from parents, because if the problems are at home, they don't want their kids exposing them. And so that would be a whole other ethical, clinical consideration that we won't tackle here. But certainly there are data that we could get from parents that might speak to that. So kind of stigma around mental health in the home.
Could we also ask parents what their perception of healthy, good mental health dynamics is?
Yeah. Right. So right. And so that's the thing where we're going to start to get into some really complex intergenerational stuff. And, about how they perceive mental health, how they perceive their child getting support for their mental health. There's probably going to be some parents that are all for it, some parents that are all against it. And just knowing that, like, even if it's just through a rough survey, and right, you're going to have a response bias because not all parents are going to return it. But these are just all the concessions you have to make. Because parents are going to make a big difference in whether or not the program is successful or not. But a lot of the data you might be able to get, that would be helpful to get, you might not be able to. But certainly these are definitely data that could speak to if the program flops or floats. This could help explain it. All right, so I think that's good. We have a decent amount of formative ideas. Now we're going to do the same thing, but we're going to talk about summative data. And this is where the question in the chat of how is bullying measured? So that's a very good question. So everyone is saying, we want bullying to go down. We want bullying to go down. And a lot of times, I'll tell you, they won't even have thought about this. You will be asking this for the first time. So let's brainstorm a little. How would you measure bullying? So measure by grades. Say more about that. So you think that if they're getting poor, if they're not getting good grades, and they're probably being bullied, it might be a side effect of some mental health issues. So we could do like maybe grades, and just kind of like, do they go up, down over the course of the year? Now, grades are an interesting measure because people use them all the time in schools. Like, grades is like the thing, but there is absolutely no reliability or validity. I mean, there might be, but these are not things that are reliable and valid, right? So like, we all know, like, the good kids that get the good grades and get away with everything, a lot of it has to do with, all sorts of demographic information, things like that. And so grades you could certainly look at, but it would be a bit of a biased measure, right? Because if the teacher just doesn't like the student, then they might, teachers are very biased in how they grade. So I think it's a good idea, but you just want to have some caveats around it. So how students perceive bullying. So can you say more about that? Do you mean how they, like, how they define bullying, kind of? Or kind of what they perceive going on around them? I mean, I guess probably, okay, I see. So how do students perceive bullying? How do they define it? Perfect. But then also, what do they see going on around them? All right, this is where we're really gonna, again, need those students. So like, the people that the thing is for end up being the most important people, because they're gonna be your key informants, they're gonna be your participants, they're like everything. That's exactly right, Andrea. This is where I would certainly recommend doing a lit search, because you don't know. You can see what things are commonly measured. But the thing is, a lot of times, if the program is really novel, you're not necessarily going to have a lot of literature to go on. You certainly can look at how, other studies that have measured bullying. There's billions of those. And so looking for validated measures is going to be really important. Are there validated measures of school climate? Are there validated measures of bullying incidents? Oftentimes, it's very rare in my experience And it might be because I left psychology. I feel like in psychology, there tend to be more, I mean, there should be, right? Like more reliable and valid data collection instruments like inventories and things like that. In education, there's not nearly as many. And so certainly you should do a lit review, but you might not always get you get good answers, but sometimes there are ones that you can't necessarily implement for various reasons. It might be that buying the survey costs a ton of money and that's like your whole budget, or, there are reasons, but I think you're certainly right. At this point, a lit review would be appropriate for sure. So one thing about bullying is that it's probably going to be grossly underreported if we look at only school level metrics. So they might say, oh, look, we can look and say how many students went to the principal's office, or how many students got suspended, or whatever. But the same with anything like this, it's going to be underreported. And certain types of bullying are much more observable than others. Physical bullying, yes, it is happening. They are fighting. More relational aggression, gossiping, that type of stuff, much, much harder to capture. For that reason, it's good to get the school level metrics. And that might be all the key stakeholders care about. They want to know that there's 20% fewer kids going to detention. Maybe that's all they care about. But from our side, we know that so much of bullying is going to fly under the radar. For that reason, it's super important to talk to students. Also very important to talk to teachers and school staff. So teachers witness a lot in the classroom, right? Probably more than we would think. I mean, not more than we think, but especially if you've ever taught, like, it's very obvious when people aren't paying attention. It's very obvious, like when, and so I think that teachers could be very key informants. Ooh, yeah, school nurses. That's a great idea. So that's another one, right? Where it's like, who are the people that actually can get us the information we want to know, right? So now we're in this phase of the evaluation where we've talked to our stakeholders. We know what their goals are, but now we have our goal of actually trying to measure this stuff. And so this is how you'd go about doing it. You got to talk to people. Now, the one downside of talking to people is you don't get a pretty graph where your school's above the national average or whatever. But some of these data are probably not necessarily going to go into your evaluation report, the qualitative stuff, but it's going to be stuff that informs your quantitative data collection instruments. So it might be things you didn't even know to ask about. You have 2 conversations with the school nurse and you're like, oh, I didn't realize this was a problem. So and it changes how you quantify things. And so it's really important to kind of do some of these surveys, interviews, both for formative data, but also for summative data when you're getting ideas for how to measure this stuff. Because I'm not an expert in bullying. I know nothing about it. I mean, except for my own life experiences, right? And so knowing what bullying looks like in that school and kind of knowing what to look out for really can help inform how you quantitatively track that stuff. I would describe it as a sequential mixed methods. Yes, that's exactly right. Almost every evaluation I do is mixed methods, just because I think that a good evaluation should look at whatever the phenomenon is through multiple lenses, because you do get different information, right? It's not that quantitative is better than qualitative or vice versa. It's that they're there to answer very different types of questions. And so that's exactly how I'd rate it up. And that's exactly what we're doing is it's iterative, right? So you have an idea and you maybe go to maybe you have an advisory board at the school that has, the nurse group of teachers and a couple administrators, and you give them the survey, and maybe a couple students, even maybe you have a separate group of students, just a few, and you show them your survey and you're like, does this resonate with you? Do you think we'll capture it using these questions? And you really want to rely on them to help you make a good instrument. Now, in the case where you already have a validated instrument, I still think it's important to do one that you have designed that is customized for your evaluation, because sometimes things that are validated are so general that they might not actually tap in. I mean, like theoretically, right? If there's like an existing inventory about bullying, we should be able to give it at the beginning and give it at the end and theoretically see a difference, right? But what if it's more nuanced than that, right? We want to have that validated measure pre and post. And if we see a significant difference, great, our work is done. But if we don't, we're going to want to have our data that help to explain that null result, right? So then, and then what's nice is if you have the survey you've created and you have some similar questions on the validated one, you actually can correlate items from the survey that you've developed with items from the existing instrument as a kind of pseudo measure of concurrent validity of the survey you've come up with. But ideally, you want to do a lot of talking to people. You want to pilot your data collection instruments with the people that will be taking the survey, just because if you have a poorly designed data collection instrument, you're just setting the deck up against you to not detect change, right? So in terms of how bullying is measured, it is not a straightforward question. So we have school nurses, we have kind of teacher reports, school administrator reports, and student reports. What do we do if these things are not in concert with each other? Right? Then and then that's another layer you have to start to peel back. And so you can see what starts off as like, well, we just want to see bullying go down. And then once you start thinking about it, you're like, my God, this is a nightmare. There's so much complexity, right? And so you think of all these things, like how's the bullying measured? How's it gonna go? And then you get into the complexity and you're just like, this is not at all straightforward. I've never signed up for an evaluation and had it be as straightforward as I thought it was going to be. It always is more complex. And these are all things that you have to think about, because so I should say sometimes there are schools or nonprofits that have like a research and evaluation officer that often has a PhD. That person, make best friends with them, because that's going to be a nice person to have as a liaison between you and the stakeholders. But a lot of times you don't have that liaison. And so it's so important. There's someone that understands research, but also understands the goals of the school in a way that's probably more in depth than you, as someone that's involved. So they can be a nice kind of bridge. And so if you have that, if there's such a person, make best friends with them. I don't mean that literally, but I did end up becoming really good friends with someone I've never met in person in Utah, who was the evaluation officer for a nonprofit I did a ton of evaluation for. We're still friends. Because a lot of times they're like your sanity check. Like, it's like, like they understand the complexity of it, and they can be your friend and help managing expectations. But I'm assuming today that you're not going to have that person, because I want to set you up for the messiest experience. And then when you go to do it, you'll be ready and you'll be maybe pleasantly surprised at it being a little bit more straightforward. So anyhow, so we have all these different ways of measuring bullying. How, if at all, do we want to differentiate between physical aggression and relational aggression? The school doesn't differ. They just say bullying. So us as researchers, we know that there's a difference, right? We know that there's gender differences in how aggression is expressed, all sorts of, demographic things that could impact it. How do we want to kind of deal with that nuance? Do we want to deal with that nuance? So if it were me, I would probably, since in the literature, and I just happen to know this, I mean, I'm not like up on the bullying literature, but there's, more girls tend to, yeah, exactly. It could be important for addressing it. The strategies would be different. Physical aggression and relational aggression are different. And so it could be really important at this stage to also talk to your key stakeholders. And some of them are going to be already on this list about how they would define bullying. And at this point, it would be really important to strong arm a little bit your key stakeholders into agreeing to a definition. Because as you point out, Megan, it's going to be different. And so you need to know, like, are they worried about physical bullying, or are they worried more about relational aggression and like online and stuff that trickles into online and all of that kind of messiness? And how, if there's bullying going on online, how do we deal with that? Like literally, this might seem like an extreme example, but it's not. Like people are like, I want to see this. And then there's all this nuance that they don't necessarily consider because they're not trained to. And so it's your job to consider it and deal with it. So what you'd have to do at this point is meet with your stakeholders and make some hard decisions, like I said, about how we're defining bullying. And this might happen after you collect these data. So you might have an idea in your head, like, this is the best way I think to measure it. And then you're going to want to go to your key stakeholders and be like, this is how we're defining bullying. This is how we're measuring bullying. Because you do not want to decide on something, collect all your data, and then at the end of the year have them be like, what? You want to make sure that they are on board with the definition. And if they want to make it more complex, then I always put the onus on them. And they're like, well, it's really important that we know about what's happening online. And then I say, okay. A lot of times they'll say that without having thought it all through. So not only are there privacy concerns, but like, what is someone going to do? Like go undercover onto like Snapchat and like if there's just a lot of like realistic things. And then you start to see where it's like, well, is the bullying really going to go down? Or are we just going to be counting less of it? Because people will get savvy to how to circumvent it. And that's where talking to the students is going to be, again, so important. Really, in my opinion, if I was really doing this, I would say that student reports and students' reports of being bullied, students' reports of feeling, having feelings of well-being, that for me would probably be my key outcome, just because it's gonna be the most valid indicator of actual bullying, the people that are experiencing it. And we'd probably want to ask questions not only about them being the victim, but also the perpetrators. Now, how much they'll actually report on it is an empirical question. But right, that's the best we can do. And sometimes that has to be good enough. And this is where evaluation can get really frustrating for researchers, because our inclination as researchers is to want to get rid of this messiness and want to control for it. But you don't have that luxury in evaluation. It's just literally the best you can do with the cards you've been dealt. And in this case, I would think that students and teachers potentially are probably going to be the best informants of what has happened with bullying. And someone might disagree, and that's okay. Like it's based on individual preference, but then it's important to go to your key stakeholders and explain exactly how you got to that decision, why you got there, and make sure you have their buy-in. They might be like, I don't care what the students think, which like is horrible, but you might encounter that. And then it's like, well, okay, maybe you don't care, but here's all the reasons why it's important for us to talk to the students, because there's underreporting of bullying incidents. A lot of it happens behind closed doors or online. A lot, like list all these reasons, like, so for these reasons, this is why I arrived at this. And sometimes they might not be happy with it, but that's the best you can do, right? Anything else we would want to measure? So they care very much about bullying, but are there any other things that we would expect to decrease as well? So, or increase. So like we talked about, well-being might go up, feelings of safety might go up. Anything else? Okay. So now what we're going to do is we're going to think about how we would then fit all of this complexity into a $15,000 budget. So as a rule of thumb, usually sometimes somewhere between 10 and 20% of an overall budget is earmarked for evaluation. It is never enough. And it's, you're almost always kind of like doing things like as cheap as possible. I mean, I feel like that's true with research in general, but like, we're talking like it's like 150,000 and you get 15,000. And that might seem like a lot, but it's not, particularly if you consider that if you work for, say, an evaluation company or you run your own business, there's going to be some overhead that eats that up. So in most places I've worked, overhead's been 50%. So if we get 15 grand for an evaluation, that means we actually get 7,500, which isn't a lot. But that's the budget that we're going to be working in today. We're going to get $7,500 to do all of this. And that includes, so that includes not your time, because theoretically your time might be built. I mean, it gets a little messy. We won't get in the weeds with it, but we'll pretend for this example that we have $7,500 to do this entire year-long study. So I'm going to open up Excel. Oops. Okay, so what I'm going to have you all do is either in the chat or feel free to shout it out. What are some things we would need? How would we use this budget? What are we going to need to do this study? So we have all of these ideas for the data we can collect, but now we're faced with the reality of fitting it into a oh, damn, thanks. I didn't realize I couldn't. All right, now I'm sharing it. Here we go. Okay. So now we're in our budget. So now it's like we have all these great ideas and all this complexity we need to weed through, but we only have $7,500 to do it. And they're pretty much expecting amazing results. So what's something we need money for? It doesn't have to be in any particular order. What's something we need money for? My cat just meowed. I don't know if you heard her. She has ideas. Participant incentive, sure. And we'll just say, we'll figure this out when we actually go through what we're doing. So yeah, so the evaluator, so that's kind of embedded already. So we're just talking $7,500 above and beyond. Printing cost. If we're doing lots of focus groups and talking to people, yep, interview transcription, statistical software. Nope, exactly. You need, if you're going to have meetings with people, if you're going to run focus groups, guess what increases your participation? Snacks. So food, travel money, right? So if you're the evaluator going to be going back and forth to the school, if you're going to be traveling to the nonprofit, if you're going to, whatever it is, you might need money for travel costs. A wine fund for when you're stressed. No, I'm kidding. That's always the most important line item. But right, so, okay, so let's think a little bit. Oh yeah, digital recorders. Oops, skipping around, it's the new computer. If we're sending out surveys, you know, SurveyMonkey has a free version, but it has a lot of limitations. You might need money for survey dissemination. Like if you want to get a gold subscription to SurveyMonkey or something. Dissemination, I'm like, that's the hardest word to spell ever. Or survey dissemination program, SurveyMonkey. You might need a laptop or a tablet to bring with you to collect data. So you can start to see how all of a sudden these things start to add up. And so now we're faced with this decision. We only have $7,500 and we have to collect all of these data. So now going back to So we have this kind of list. This is truly like literally what we're doing now is literally the steps I go through when I'm doing an evaluation. So then I make a list of like, here are all the things I can possibly think of that I'll need money for. Okay. And then this is going to add up to, I mean, the survey statistical software alone might be your whole budget, right? So you definitely want to invest in learning R because it's free, but that costs money too to take a course or whatever. So we have all these things. So now let's look back at our, and I know I'm going to stop sharing and reshare so you can actually see it. So now let's make some hard decisions about what we're actually going to do, and then we'll go back and revisit the budget. Okay. So of all of these, I'm only one person. The evaluator is only one person, and it's only going to be a fraction of your time. What are these things that you think absolutely cannot go versus what are the things that probably we can do without? If you had, we're admitting that they're all important, but you can't do them all. So what's going to be the first to go? For me, although I think it would be good to talk to the parents, it's so logistically complicated that I think that for the sake of parsimony and not making ourselves insane, I think we can not talk to the parents. And again, you will approve all this with the key stakeholders once you're done, but this is where they look to you for your expertise and a judicious use of the budget. So for me, I don't think we're going to get a lot of bang for a buck from the parents, probably low survey responses, and the responses we do get are going to be biased just because, you know, we're not going to get probably not a good response rate. And so that's the first one I would cut probably.
Could we be more selective with that just before cutting it? Like, for example, decide to send surveys only to the parents of kids who use the services.
So we could do that, but it's supposed to be confidential. So if we send a survey home, then it's not confidential anymore that they did it.
Ah, okay.
But it's a good thought. But see, this is where you start to, it's like, we could do this. And it's like, then the real world comes in. So it's a great thought, but is like, so right, without identifying the kids to their parents, what can we ask about? Now, you could potentially ask students, you could have students consent to have their parents contacted, but that opens up a whole nother can of worms around kind of trustworthiness and is it actually, you know, so I feel like involving the parents, especially with middle schoolers, it might make it tricky. And also, I'm not sure we're going to get great data from them. Okay, so Megan says she would prioritize the teacher focus groups, student interviews, and student anonymous surveys. Okay. So the student interviews. So this really is, so what I would do if I was doing this, to just tell you, like, and really getting concrete, I would have the counselors have a master sheet of the students' names, and I'd have the counselors assign every kid a unique ID, a number. And so the first kid that comes in is kid number 1, and then they will track how many times kid number 1 comes to them. And then they'll, you know, and so each kid will have a unique identifier. So in doing that, we can get a list of we can get ideas of which kids came, how many kids were repeat customers, and if they come in groups, what configurations they come in. So then from that, we'll get percentage, you know, number of visits. We might have the counselor track the type of issue. Now, we can't get too nitty gritty with that question because it violates confidentiality, but maybe it's like a physical aggression issue, depression, like something really general where you can put a list of like all the potential things and they can just check. Now, again, we'd have to actually consider if this violates issues of confidentiality, but pretending we can keep it at a sufficiently high level where it's just a very general bucket that their visit can be put into, maybe we have the counselors just do a little code that's like, student 1 came to visit, it was depression. Student 1 came again, depression. So you start to get a sense of who's coming, how many different unique visitors you're getting. maybe students always come in groups, maybe they never come in groups. This would be really helpful to know for future implementations of such a program. So here I meant to type nature of session. Okay, so maybe it's something like that. So that gives us a good indication of who's been going and who's what. So that's a piece of formative data that I would put on the counselors. In this case, you probably don't need to incentivize the counselor to give you data because they're sufficiently invested in the program. But this is the type of stuff I'd ask them, just really general, to give us a sense of, again, fidelity of participation, as well as to some extent fidelity of implementation, because you know if the teachers are not tracking, the counselors aren't tracking this data, that there's a bigger issue about fidelity of implementation. And so this would be an important data for you to collect. So now focus groups with teachers. Let's think about that. Before I move on to teachers, are there any other data we would want to collect from the counselors? Yeah, probably not. I mean, just knowing how many students are getting, like, that's really all we need to know from them probably. So now teachers.
Well, we could also ask the counselors to ask qualitative questions to the students that they could report back to us confidentially without breaking confidence.
Yeah,
For
that's
example,
a really good idea.
Do you feel that these sessions have been helpful?
Yes, that's exactly right. So we could either do it as counselor asks, which guarantees data, but the student might lie, right? Like they might feel like the social desirability or whatever. So they might, counselor might ask, but you'll get a response. The alternative may be, maybe they get a text on their phone after this, within 10 minutes after their session to get feedback. Now that you're going to get better data because it's anonymous, but you're going to have non-responders. So this is one of those things where it's like, it's really like you have to just make a call and go with it. Or you can, I'll just say ping their phones, and hopefully that makes sense, to ask their feedback. And this kind of gets into the student satisfaction with counseling, right? And that's going to be really important. Anything else we would want the counselors to do potentially, or any feedback about the counseling sessions we would want to get from students?
Students should be, students are obviously two groups, the students who have used the services and those who haven't.
Very right.
So you need to define which questions you would ask of each and then how you might go about doing that. So that's
right.
Those focus groups with students. Maybe you have well, you can't have two focus groups because they can't self-identify if they've used the services.
Right.
Uh,
But yeah, see, it's like whack. I always say evaluations like whack-a-mole, because as soon as you think you solve a problem, you're like creating another one. And it is like, this is really what it's like. Like, you're like, how am I supposed to do this? It's not possible, but you gotta do it. But yeah, it's tricky. So yeah, one thing you could theoretically do is, right, if you have students who haven't used the services, you have a built-in comparison group. But there are a lot of reasons why that might not be a good comparison group. Does anyone want to venture some guesses or some suggestions as to why they might not be a good comparison group? So one big issue is self-selection, right? So the students that go for the help might be fundamentally different from the students that don't, right? And we have no way of knowing that. And so for that reason, you could do it. And this is true, I think, of probably any quasi-experimental. So in case you're just assuming no prior knowledge, so the difference between experimental and quasi-experimental is quasi-experimental doesn't have random assignment. So you do still have a treatment, and I call it a comparison group when we're talking about quasi-experimental, because it's not a control group because you're not randomly assigning. But basically, anytime you have a quasi-experimental design, which is very common in evaluation because it's very hard to, a lot of things like this, you can't ethically randomly assign people into. But sorry, what were you going to say? Someone going to talk? I missed it. No.
Oh, I think I was on a little bit of a different track. Just the idea that, so if you ask counselors how many students you've seen, you invite students to respond to a ping they received on their phone, and also have counselors ask them for their evaluation of how helpful it was. All of those together give you an interesting set of data, because you could say 30 people have looked for the services, 4 people responded to counselor inquiry on how effective it was, 6 people responded to pinging on their phones, and then the rest of them didn't respond at all. And here are the results from that collection. And then you have more complexity that way.
Yeah, that's a really great thought. And that makes total sense, right? So looking at different patterns of responding or non-responding can tell you a lot, actually. It's a great thought.
Could you say more about the quasi-experimental aspect that you were touching on? I thought that was really interesting.
Absolutely. So a lot of times, right, when you're evaluating something that's supposed to make things better, right? Like, so for example, a lot of the work I do in medical education, it's just not ethical not to withhold the intervention from a group of people. So you have really 2 options in that scenario. In that scenario, you either, so where you can't randomly assign, you have more than 2 options, but 2 primary ones. One is a pre-post where you're just looking within change for people. This is not quasi-experimental, but it is one that is very often done. And for me, pre-post we can talk more about that after if we want to. But there's some major cons, as I'm sure you can guess. With quasi-experimental though, what you're essentially doing is you're taking a group of people who just aren't getting the intervention for whatever reason. So for example, at BU, there are residents. There's 40 residents in internal medicine, and they're broken into 4 pods. And each week, each pod gets didactic. So like basically when I teach the residents, I have to teach the same thing 4 Fridays in a row. Like, it's so boring by the end. But it's nice because it's like, well, the 2 pods that get it first can be my treatment group, and the 2 pods that get it after are still getting it. But if I assess them at baseline, then their baseline data before they've gotten the intervention is their counterfactual, because here's what students look like without the intervention. And so you can kind of stagger it in that way, where you collect data from everybody halfway through, and then half the people have had it and half the people haven't yet. And so that's a nice quasi-experimental design that you could employ where you don't have this issue of people getting something withheld from them. Another option is to do the same thing, but if you can build in random assignment, obviously that just makes it a little bit more rigorous, because now you're moving from quasi-experimental, where the groups were just naturally occurring, to you making the groups. And so in those instances, when you still have this kind of like ethical issue, what I usually do is I'll randomly assign people to get the intervention first. And then the control group will get it after, but still it's that same model of collecting data in the middle when half of your people haven't gotten it yet. And that to me is the cleanest, nicest comparison you can get in the absence of true random assignment. Oops. Does that answer your question? Would you like me to say more about any aspects of that?
No, that's great. Thank you.
Of course. And then just to talk for a moment about the pre-post. So I always joke, like, with pre-post evaluations, like a lot of times people will ask like, oh, was this informative? Was it helpful? Was it relevant? And, you know, if people have just been sitting through a session or whatever that you're evaluating, and they've been told for the last hour, like the rationale for doing something or why something's good, asking for opinions and attitudes and seeing change from pre to post is not that compelling. I always joke, I'm like, that bar is so low, you're going to trip over it, right? And that's true in general. But the thing is, if you don't understand research, that might be compelling to you. And so in these situations, particularly when you're working with outside people, is really getting them to think like, so a lot of times people in schools will want to measure knowledge change. And it's like, oh, I did this awesome math intervention for third graders, and I want to look at their math ability before and after. And it's like, well, they're gonna have got better at math regardless of your intervention because they've had a year of schooling. So trying to think about kind of like parsing out the effects of a particular intervention from like larger schooling can be so tricky. And like I said, those effects tend to be small. And so I'm not saying that it's impossible, but I'll put it this way. The only truly experimental evaluation I've ever worked on was a multi-million-dollar grant. And we had to get buy-in from all the schools. The schools were randomly assigned. And it was a logistical and administrative nightmare, but research-wise, it was very rigorous. But yeah, bringing experimental design to evaluation is very hard. And basically, you spend most of the time trying to get as close to the gold standard as you can and just failing miserably. But you still have to try to make lemonade out of those lemons. They're still going to want answers at the end. And so then it's like, well, and so this is where kind of some of the stress can come in, to be honest. So going back to this, so we have the counselor data, the teacher data. So we know that we're going to have, for every session, we're going to collect some data. When would we want to collect data from teachers? So we're going to do some teacher focus groups. When would we want to do the focus group? So say we'll do more than one. How would we want to sample for that? And when would we want to conduct them, do you think? Any ideas? So what I might do, so the first things first, anytime you're doing focus groups, you need to provide food or snacks or drinks or something. It is very rare that people sign up to do focus groups. In fact, on the break, I got a text from one of my coworkers and they're like, has anyone signed up for the focus group on Wednesday yet? And I was like, no, which is tomorrow. I'm like, yeah, no one signed up. That's a great idea, Megan. So I would probably say the same thing. We're going to do focus groups at baseline. So I'll just, before the program starts, midway, and at the end. So maybe 3 focus groups. And do we want it to be, do you think the same group of teachers or would you want different teachers? And that really is an empirical question. The reason is because, so with qualitative, right, tracking people over time, you can't really, I mean, you can do it, don't get me wrong, like you can do, in-depth interview studies and stuff like that, but in the focus group, it's going to be a little hard to look for like change over time within teachers. And so you may want to just take a random sample and stick with that random sample, or you may want to take a random sample at each time and talk to different teachers to get more of a swath of what might be going on. But certainly before, midway, and at the end, I would think would be the best times to do it. And what would be a couple questions? We don't have to go crazy with this, but what would be, a question or two that we'd want to ask the teachers in this focus group?
Maybe like, please discuss any types of bullying that you've noticed in your classroom.
Sure. So discuss or maybe it could be like, think about the last month. What instances, I mean, this isn't exactly how I'd write it, but what instances of bullying have you seen in your classroom? Right? Something like that. So just really, and again, it's focus groups. We want to keep it really open-ended, just like talk a little bit, like, what do you see in the hallways, in the classroom? And then what you can do is, ideally what you would look for as the evaluator are changes in themes. Oh, how often you have to send students to resolution. Yeah.
And would you want to only focus on the classroom? Because, teachers hear a lot in the hallways.
Yep.
There's so many places, cafeterias. How do you create just like hearsay sort of?
Yes. And this is like, if you're familiar with the movie The Breakfast Club, I think of the scene with the janitor. He's like, I'm the eyes and ears of this institution. Like, I know everything that goes on here. If you haven't seen The Breakfast Club, it's a good classic. But really this idea is that there's so much going on just under the surface. Ooh, bus drivers, that's a really good one. Hard to get data from them potentially, but like bus drivers, they see like, oh, that's such a good suggestion, Megan. I love that idea. So how, like, so we'll talk the contexts of bullying. And maybe what do they hear? So you might ask, have you heard of instances of students being bullied online? Like what, like just to really get a sense of what they're kind of hearing.
And I think we spoke about this already, but some of these are formative, probably.
Exactly. Some of them are formative and some of them are going to be summative. And what's important to me is the data collection for formative and summative. A lot of times it's done together. What's important for me is conceptually thinking about, okay, what are the things that the stakeholders care about versus what are the things I need to care about as the person that needs to report to the stakeholders. And those aren't always the same thing. And so like the collection is sometimes like you'll give formative surveys with summative questions. It doesn't look that clean, but conceptually I keep it clean in the planning stages just because you want to be able to explain null results. That's if you leave with no other tip from today, an evaluation, set yourself up to be able to posit theories about why there may be no results. And having these teacher focus groups, maybe you learn from the focus groups that there's tons of bullying going on online. Like maybe you learn that, and that's going to be super important data to share with your key stakeholders. Because it's like, if you want to see bullying going down, a lot of it's happening in this place. You're probably not going to see evidence of that. So you have to kind of rethink like what their expectations. So that's a place where you have to manage their expectations. Like, this is what I learned from the teachers. A lot of it's happening under, the radar or from home or on the buses or whatever it is. And that's going to be real. And that's like, so we don't see a difference in the metrics we've used to measure bullying because we're not using the right metrics. And sometimes that's sometimes that's what you learn during the first year of evaluation, is that the metrics you started off with are completely not the right metrics to be using. But you got to roll with it, right? Would we want to collect, here's,
I have a question though. Forgive me.
Go ahead.
Do you have any stories that you could share about like how you were successful in explaining no results? I mean, that maybe you didn't anticipate that there would even be no results, but how through your evaluation approach, it was really helpful in the end. It saved your skin basically, or whatever you call it.
Yeah. Oh Lord, I have so many. Yes. Okay. So this is, I mean, I have to be kind of judicious about what I share, but this is an example where I think it's telling, and Christine, I'll get to your question because we're going to do a little more of this and then we're going to go back to the budget and talk feasibly about what this stuff would cost. So for example, there was one, a math intervention that was done. And it was an intervention for elementary school students, but the intervention was with teachers. It was professional development. So the teachers go to the professional, couple weeks long, it was really intensive professional development. And then we see no differences in the student scores, okay? No differences at all. And it's really confusing because it's like, wait, the teachers, like we paid for their substitutes, they got like, and so it was like, wait, what? And so we learned actually from looking, we measured some stuff along the way. So one thing that we measured was teacher self-efficacy in teaching math. And there was actually a validated instrument for that, luckily. And we did it, and we actually found that throughout the training, teachers' self-efficacy went down. And what was happening is they were realizing how much they didn't know. So at the beginning, they were like, yeah, no, I'm pretty good. I'm good at like that stuff like that. And then they start to get in the, oh, I really didn't know this stuff. And so what you actually see in real time almost is the teachers making that realization, but then there hasn't been enough time for them to make changes in their practice yet, because they're still wrapping their heads around what they need to do differently, what they maybe need to learn or explain differently or whatever. And so there actually just hadn't been enough time. And sure enough, in the second year, once the teachers had a year to kind of like process and like make changes to their practice, all of a sudden then those students score. So it took a year, and it wasn't until after the year that we saw a difference. So yeah, that's kind of an example of where that happened, where if we didn't have those self-efficacy data, and kind of talking to the teachers, you might just think, oh, well, it doesn't work, it's a waste of money. But actually it does work, we just needed more time. And that only came out from looking at the teachers' kind of metacognition about what they were learning. So in terms of budgeting, okay, so we only have a half an hour, so I'm gonna kind of just speed things up a little bit in terms of, because I think it's really important to talk about budgeting, because you almost are trying to, so what the point I'm trying to make here is that all of these data you would need to answer this question, they're not necessarily going to be at your fingertips. And so we decided here that we want to do 3 teacher focus groups, right? So now I'm going to stop sharing and reshare. Let budget go. Oops, 1 second there. Okay, so what we're gonna do, so now we're gonna budget out what those focus groups alone are gonna cost, okay? So participant incentives. So I'm gonna break this down even further because we're gonna have multiple incentives that new computer, I don't know how to do anything, I apologize. Okay, teacher focus groups. Okay, so we're doing 3 focus groups, right? So I'm just gonna make this a little bit bigger. So what do we need for the focus groups? So say we want to give every teacher that shows up to the focus group, what's a good incentive? Maybe $25 to Target or something, or Amazon. So let's pretend we're, just for the sake of math, we're going to say a focus group with 10 people. You should have fewer people in your focus group, but for math, we'll say 10 people. So if we want to give everyone a $25 gift card, that is $250 per focus group, which is $750 for just the incentives. Now, we also are going to want to provide food. This obviously varies, but usually, I mean, for only 10 people, you can probably get away with like, what I usually do is like a grocery run. Like it feels like there should be more formal ways of doing this, but I always just like waltz in with like my Whole Foods bag and I'm like, here's some hummus and carrots and stuff. So let's just say we're doing $30 per focus group for food. That's 90. We'll just round up to $100 for focus groups. So again, this is just for the teacher focus groups. Oops. Included myself. Okay, so what else do we need money for? We need money for transcription of the focus groups. So the rule of thumb I use for transcription is it's usually $1.99 per recorded minute. Okay, that's like usually how I budget it. I really encourage you. So like transcription is one of those things where people are like, well, I can just do it. Don't, if you have budget for someone to do the transcription, because it is, if you've ever done it, you know, unless it's something you're very passionate about and it's like a good zone out activity for you. I myself hate doing transcription and not particularly good at it. So let's say it's $2 per recorded minute for the sake of math. And let's say each focus group is 60 minutes, 60 recorded minutes. So that's going to be $120 per focus group, which is $360. Where's transcription costs? Oh, here it is. What did I just say it was going to be? Like $360. Interview and focus group. So we now, with just this data collection, we'll do 7,500. That's like 16% of our budget, just from getting these data from these teachers. Now, as the evaluator, I think that talking to teachers is going to be so important. So I think we would want to keep these in, and that's probably a big chunk of money. Now, going back to our other document, I'm just going to look at it. I'm not going to unshare and reshare. So something else we wanted to do is we want to have the counselors track what the student's doing. Now, for me, I don't think incentivizing the counselors in this case is really necessary because it's just basic bookkeeping work. It's not going to add that much time. And they are very invested in the program being successful. So I would say we don't necessarily need to include anything for the counselor data. So that kind of saves us. But now we want to think about collecting data from the students. Now, keep in mind, the students are literally like the lifeblood of this evaluation. If we don't get data from the students, it's not going to be nearly as informative. And so we talked about doing student surveys, doing student focus groups. So let's say, so I'm just going to put here, we do 3 teacher focus groups. And then for students, how many focus groups do you think we want to do with students? We talked about doing some before to get like how, more like how can we get uptake among students? Like what ways can it be advertised or communicated to them? So that's one focus group. What other, do we need any other focus groups from the students, do you think? Maybe not. Okay, so we'll do one student focus group. And we know from this that the focus group, so during the program, it could be during, but you might want to do it before to talk about how the program is going to be unrolled, to know how to best present it to students. What are they going to be most receptive to? You almost maybe want to think about that initial focus group as like, kind of like the way focus groups are used for like movies and stuff like that. Like, it's like, does this appeal to you? Is this something you want to participate in? It can be a really good litmus test for how the students at large might respond to it. So I would probably do one focus group at the beginning. And we know that one focus group, so now we're going to add it. I'll just make another column here. We can sum them up after, but we know we're going to need to have incentives for the students, because that's going to be necessary. So we'll do the same incentives. So it's $250 because it's just one focus group. We need $120 for transcription, and then we'll say $30 for food. Okay.
Yeah, but with students, couldn't you save a little money, like give them a $20 gift certificate?
You could, yeah. So let's do that. So
And
then
then maybe give them pizza, because that's
yeah. So maybe we'll order pizza. So we'll say $25 for pizza. We'll save a little money there, right? So sorry, oh yeah. So we could do a focus group during the program as well. what I would say is, since we're already, we're already at like 20% of our budget, what I would say is have it in the back of your head to do a mid-year focus group, but only do that focus group if there is no uptake of the program. So like if students are signing up for it and things are going well, there might not be a reason to talk to students in this way again. I mean, you'll get data from them through surveys, etc. But I don't know. I mean, then it could be, it's more money, and if they're kind of good, things are going well, it might not be clear what the purpose of that focus group is. Because, for example, you're probably not going to get good data on bullying from a focus group, maybe from interviews, but interviews, I think with this budget, are way too cost intensive, other than the informational interviews we talked about. But doing interviews as a research method is usually not very cost effective in evaluation, just because the amount of time and stuff, you get great data, but it's a lot of time. And in focus groups, students definitely probably aren't going to be, depending on who's in the focus groups, probably not really willing to share a lot of vulnerable information, especially at their age, especially in groups. But if they're not kind of going through it, would be, if people aren't using it, then you might be like, hey, why is no one using it? So Megan, yeah, anonymous surveys are gonna be the best bet for students. And so I would think, and we talked about this, I probably want to do a survey at 3 time points. I'd probably want to do a baseline survey, a mid-year survey, and an end-of-year survey. And this is going to be a pretty long survey because, like we talked about, we'll probably want to ask some questions about climate. We'll probably ask some questions about the types of bullying they've seen, the types of bullying they've been a victim of, the types of bullying they've perpetrated. Now, obviously, people aren't going to be 100% honest, but they never are. That's just one of the things you have to deal with, right? But by ensuring the students that it is anonymous, you'll hopefully get better reporting. And so that's going to be really important, but because the surveys are going to be longer and because they are so vitally important to the thing, we're going to want to really incentivize students to do them. So what I would say, what I do with surveys usually for incentives is it can be very cumbersome to give every student who does the survey an incentive. It's really hard to track that. It's just an administrative nightmare. So what I almost always do is raffles. So I'll say, we have, maybe like 2 $100 gift cards or 3 or whatever it is. And say, if you do the survey, you will then be entered. And so I usually set it up so that the survey is anonymous. I do it in Qualtrics. This is maybe too much information, but I set it up so that the survey is anonymous. And then at the end of the survey, they're redirected to a survey where they can choose to enter a raffle. So that way their identifiable information is kept separate from their survey responses. And then what I do is I just will do a raffle and then the winners get the prizes. So research has shown that when you use this method, it is effective, but people do take into consideration their odds of winning. So if there's 1,000 students and you're like, we have 1 gift card, you're going to get a lower response rate than if you have 100 gift cards. And so you'll really want to think, so we didn't talk about what the school size is, but let's say it's like a smallish school. So maybe we can offer, so for incentives, we can offer, let's see, how about, we'll say $100 each time, $100 worth of incentives at each survey. So that's $300 for the surveys. That's not terribly expensive. And teachers could also be asked to provide the link. That's exactly right. I would exactly recommend that. So I do the same thing with the med students and the residents now. Is what I have people do is I email the link out like 10 minutes before the session's over. And then it's nice because if they're filling it out electronically, it's anonymous to the teacher who is and isn't completing it. But I will tell you, between us that when you do that, you get a much higher response rate, because the option is to just sit there and do nothing or do the survey. I mean, they could be on their phone doing other things, but that's a great suggestion, Andrea. That's exactly how I would do it. And so then we have about $300 for the student surveys. So that brings us to $2,000. So now we're looking at, okay, so for the main data collection, we're not doing too shabby. We have like $1,900. Now we want to think about other things like the, are there any other data collection things that we'd want to do? So we talked about doing the teacher focus groups. We talked about doing the student surveys. We talked about the focus group. For the key informant interviews, so like we talked about talking to the school nurse or talking to even some bus drivers, that again, you would want to really consider those key informant interviews versus like robust qualitative interviews, because these are really about getting information from people and not about getting their raw reactions, which then you're going to code for themes, but really just like, okay, I need to know, like, how's it run in here? Like, how's it go? Just so you have a better understanding of what you're walking into. So for those, you wouldn't need to provide incentives, but you certainly would need to buy a digital recorder. You probably also would need to buy like an external hard drive or something to store the recordings on. So we're at about 2,000 for our research incentives, and that leaves us about 5,000 for the other stuff we need to buy. So a laptop or a tablet, statistical software, travel costs, whatever we need. Or we might decide, you know what, it would be really helpful to do another teacher focus group. Well, now we have a little bit extra. So what I like to, I mean, I will say it usually doesn't work out like this. Usually you're like creeping up against your budget and have to go the other way. But I just wanted to put this in because this is truly what I do is I think of all the things I would need to collect, and then I start paring it down. And it's like, okay, these are the 3 things I can't do without. The 3 things I can't do without come to about 2,000. So now I'm going to go back and revisit my list of all where I did kind of like my brain dump. I'm gonna be like, what else can we add in? And that's, I truly do it like almost like a la carte, like, okay, like these focus groups cost $1,200. So if I wanted to do another set of 3 focus groups with different teachers, it would be double. So like I kind of price things out like this just to get heuristics. And then I go back to my master list and I'm like, okay, what can I pull back in? But you really want to start with your non-negotiable must-have data from these people to have an evaluation, and then make sure you can afford that and then start adding things in. So I'm cognizant of time. It's about, we're just about 15 minutes away. So I would like to stop now doing the exercise and just leave time for questions. So I'm going to stop sharing. And so what I'm going to send you tomorrow is the simulation document with all of my notes, as well as the things we talked about. So right now you have a blank version. Tomorrow you'll have a fully populated version that kind of walks you through the steps and the different considerations at each step. And my hope is that by having that guide and having gone through this process, you have a better and more perhaps realistic understanding of what doing evaluation is really like. This is truly how I spend a lot of my days, is kind of going through these brain dumps and then budging it out. And again, it's iterative. You're always revisiting things because you need to be. So I hope that this was helpful. So I'm going to stop sharing now and just kind of open the floor for any questions people have. It can be very specific, very general, anything's appropriate.
Christine?
This is kind of a specific general question. How about that? So I work with a program called the Eureka program with Girls Inc. And it you may have heard about it on campus, and we have girls come for the month of July, and they're around and they do a lot of STEM workshops with us. Mm-hmm. And we always have this push and pull with all the faculty who volunteer to give workshops for us, that they really want to know how they did individually in their workshop. And ideally, they want to know that their individual workshop was the inspiration that caused this girl to do better in STEM, to get better grades in STEM, to apply to college, to get into college, to get into a STEM career, and like, take the world on by storm.
Yeah.
We all know that we can't really measure that.
Right.
And we're certainly not going to measure it in the instant after your workshop. But what we might be able to measure over time and in aggregate is the improvement on the lives of this group of girls as compared to their peers.
Yes.
And so we can look at their peers in the school who aren't in the Eureka program and see how this repeated exposure to these STEM workshops and this facilitation of science and technology and engineering mathematics in their life leads them on that path. But we can't say for certain that your individual program actually did that. Is that, so I guess it's a two-part question. Number one, I instituted just like a little emoji survey that was like thumbs up, thumbs down for the individual workshops, just to get something back to the instructors. But then at the same time, we also have these longer term things where we're trying to compare the longer term demographics. If I go back to NSF or NIH and I say, this is what we got. We can prove that this program is successful at these goals, and we can say that this individual instructor got a whole bunch of heart eyes and thumbs up. What do you think? Is that in your experience of being able to like manage expectations, as you were talking about, are we doing all right with this, or how do you pitch it back to the funding agencies and the donors and stuff?
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing is, so this is not unique where people want the thing that they did to be the thing, right? And that, I mean, isn't realistic. But I think that the thing is like, how old are the kids? The girls?
They're 8th to 12th grade.
Honestly, yeah. So in general, I would say that sounds totally appropriate. One thing that we do look at, I mean, so it obviously depends on the length of the grant, et cetera. But when I was working in STEM education, one of the outcomes that people really loved is like, these people chose to major in STEM later. That is like that. So, but a lot of times, like if it's like a 2-year grant, like you don't have the money to follow them over time. And so that would be great, but like you can't quite do that. And so one thing that I've seen people do is measure intent to pursue a STEM job, or intent to like, so it's like, what do you want to be when you grow? Like, what do you want to do as a career? And are more people who participate in this program saying STEM careers? Or things like that. But I think honestly, just like a simple thumbs up, thumbs down is, if you're getting data that way, like keep doing that. But I think, yeah, honestly, like the data you get from children essentially usually tend not to be like the most robust, just for various reasons. And so I think a simple thumbs up, thumbs down, and then maybe a couple questions like interest in STEM or interest in pursuing that or something. Another thing you might, so I've seen people do is like, this might be too far afield, but like not necessarily drawing, but like, what does a scientist look like? And does their vision of what is like, which of these people is a scientist? And a lot of times they pick the white man, and then they get exposure to lots of other what scientists look like, and they have a more diverse view. I feel like that could potentially be really compelling. I mean, there are different ways you could do it, but just kind of like, what does, like, do you, it's almost like professional identity, but for kids, like, what do you, can you see yourself in these people? And I think that like we did a lot of that stuff in STEM, just because it's like, yeah, you can't follow them until they're 20. So like, so I think you have to look at the best thing you can do is look at their intentions and their kind of scope of what they think a scientist is. That would be, if you do anything else, that would be my suggestion potentially.
I mean, we can kind of follow them, and we can follow some of them. And so then that ends up being sort of a proxy. And I guess that's part of my question is the proxy good enough? Like if we have the group of girls that graduated from this program 5 years ago, and we can access some of them, and some of them have gone into STEM careers, is that enough for the workshop that happened yesterday?
Yeah, I think that's certainly adequate. Because I mean, so many, like having a parent who's in STEM is going to be a weight, like is going to matter so much, or like knowing people. And so I think that yeah, that is probably good. And I think the thing is like how they're getting into the program, like, is it a self-selection issue that the girls that are more interested in STEM are more likely to pursue it? Possibly. So I think it's worth kind of, potentially, if you can, getting a little bit of data from the girls that don't participate at baseline. I mean, it's probably too late, but like just to get a sense of like interest in science or self-efficacy. Because if it's like, well, these two groups have equal interest at the beginning, but then this group goes way up, then that's a bit more compelling.
Initially, we tried to do that, and we were working with Buju Dasgupta.
Oh yeah.
And what happened was it ended up being so difficult to survey the girls that we just couldn't. The hurdles, just the logistical hurdles of doing that, and then the little amount of information that we were getting out of that data, we just said this isn't worth it to anybody.
Yeah.
And we weren't getting that information. And I think we're doing better just by trying to track a few girls, as they mature through the program and go out of the program and see those outcomes and comparing them to their peers in the same school who aren't in the program. I think that's the best we can do.
Yeah. And maybe even, I mean, you could consider even doing some interviews with some of those girls just to see if they can, because I feel like it might be compelling to hear some of their stories about, well, then I went to this workshop and then I learned about the, like, so maybe you can get some of those more kind of like interesting or like kind of engaging narratives through some interviews.
Yeah, that's a good point. And they do, I mean, Girls Inc. itself does a lot of PR, and they do a lot of talking to the girls. And so to any extent that they grab those little nuggets from the Eureka program, we're all over that. We love it.
Yeah. That sounds really interesting. Yeah. So, yes, it is ideal to have an outside evaluator, but yeah, it isn't always possible. Even though the budget for evaluation is usually small, it still is 10%. And that can be, especially when you're just starting something out. So what I try to do, so specifically when I'm designing survey instruments or things like that, one of the things you can do is just make sure that you're, especially if you're like developing the survey on your own, if you can't find something that's validated, is making sure that you present the data collection instruments you're using to a few people, people that are outside of the project you're working on, and just people who can kind of be like, this seems like it's a little leading, this seems like it's a little biased. So certainly kind of establishing some face validity is good. If you can find instruments that have some psychometric work done on them that are valid and reliable, and you're seeing kind of differences on those, that can be pretty compelling because it's not a data collection instrument you've made. It's something someone else.
By psychometric?
Oh, I just mean like, they've established reliability and validity. So any kind of like confirmatory factor analysis or even like a Cronbach's alpha, like anything like that. And so I think that by finding data collection instruments that are seen as valid and reliable by folks outside of your inner circle, if you can show data on those existing instruments, that is pretty compelling because there's really no way for you to kind of have asked leading questions, etc., because the thing already exists. Now, as I mentioned before, the chances that you find a survey that measure the exact things you want, like I said, I think it's more common in psychology, but it still is a challenge. And so getting feedback on the questions, making sure that you're very transparent, having the raw data available to a future so making sure that, even though you don't have an outside evaluator, that you're using all the best practices, in research, so I think just trying to be as objective as possible in recognizing if you are too biased. Like if you're like, if I analyze these data and they're null, I'm going to be crushed. You shouldn't be the one analyzing the data. And if you're the only person, then just, that's what the wine fund is for. But truly, I think that the best thing you can do is partner with someone who has a little bit more distance. If it's bring someone in as a co-PI, or another option is to have an advisory board. So maybe you can't afford an evaluator, but maybe you can, there's 4 or 5 people that you get together on Zoom once a year, and you talk to them about what you're doing and how you're evaluating it. And then that advisory board, and usually I've been on a few, it's like a pretty miserable, usually 2 days of 8-hour meetings, or 1 day, it's a long meeting usually. But that can be really beneficial, because then you don't have that single evaluator working with you, but you have a small group of people. And that, I mean, it still costs money. If you do it virtually, it's much cheaper though, right? Maybe you give everyone like a small honorarium or something for participating, or in exchange for authorship, or whatever it is. But I think then an advisory board or an advisory group is your best bet.
Thanks so much, Lindsay. I'm just mindful of the time, so I'd like to suggest that we thank Lindsay for this interactive workshop, teaching us about the basics of program evaluation and all your hands-on advice and experience. And for those who want to stick around for a few minutes, maybe Lindsay, if you've got a few minutes,
Yeah,
you
I can
could
stick around.
stay, but we'll break the formal session just to respect everybody's time. Thanks so much.
Yeah, of course. And I'm happy to stay on if people have additional questions. So I'll be here for
So
a few.
I saw one very practical one is like, what's a ballpark hourly going rate for evaluation consultation?
Well, I don't do a lot of evaluation as an independent contractor, but I do a lot of statistical, I did a lot of statistical consulting as an independent contractor. What I would say is, ballpark, I would say, like, if I had to guess, like depending on your experience level, give or take 20 or 25 bucks, but probably like $100 an hour, give or take. Maybe 80 if you're more new, but I think the key thing is, if you're doing it as an independent contractor, you need to build in your overhead. So you might end up charging more than that, because this is going to be either you're doing it as like a 1099 and you have to pay taxes on it. So in that way, you want to build that overhead in. So like you're building in an extra 20, oh, what a cutie, building in some extra money to pay yourself, to pay your taxes. But yeah, I'd say, I'd say like about 100, but keep in mind that you're going to need to pay taxes on it, or if you have a lot of experience or whatever, you can get away with charging more than that. But that's my rough ballpark. Other questions? Well, I'm certainly happy to I'm going to put my email in the chat. I'm pretty bad on email, just because I think everyone is. You get 10 million a day. So if feel free to email me questions. If I don't respond, just forward it. I do not get offended. Like, you can just keep forwarding it, I'll answer. But I think the thing is that there really is no one size fits all approach to evaluation. It really is something you need to take on a case-by-case basis. And my hope is that by kind of going through my thought process and how I approach it, that it at least gave you some things to think about as you approach your own.
Oh, thanks so much for this. That was really great.
Oh, good. I'm glad. I'm kind of going rogue and but I was like, I think that to learn, if this is the best way of learning evaluation, is like, here's the real life messiness of it. And it's not always clear what you're supposed to do. And you kind of just have to make a decision and go with it. And there's a lot of uncertainty. And so when there's like, what would you collect here? And there's silence. It's like, that's oftentimes how I feel. I'm like, I don't know. Like,
well, that makes me feel less bad anyways. We don't know what we're doing, but maybe nobody does.
No, I think that's the thing, is it's like, certainly the more you do it, you learn. Like, it's like I can do some basic evaluations like in my sleep, because I've done a bajillion of them. But, sometimes I get things and I'm like someone was like, well, I want to do a podcast about like medical errors. And I want, like, the residents, they're like, we want to know if that's going to help people. And I'm like, evaluating the impact of a podcast is like so hard. But it's like, and so it's like, you really just have to like rely on your knowledge and your best practice knowledge of research and try to adhere to it as closely as you can. And oftentimes you end up way far away from it. But I am always like, as long as you know what rules you're breaking, then it's kind of like, okay, like, then, you know what I mean? Then it's more acceptable. Any other questions? Oh, yeah. So what I would recommend, so honestly, sometimes like I've done it where I've just found like an expert and emailed them cold, and I'm like, would you do it? And sometimes they say yes. So what I would do is like, shoot your shot. Like if you can get someone that's really knowledgeable, just do some research and email them. And just, I mean, you might not hear anything, but no big deal, not much loss other than a few minutes. I cold email people. I will reach out to former colleagues. So for example, I'm on the advisory board. I've been on a few advisory boards of former colleagues, and it's like, well, we know Lindsay like has expertise in these stats things, so she's our stats person on our advisory board. And then we have another person who's like a curriculum design expert on our advisory board. And so I like to think of an advisory board as like the Avengers, kind of. Like you're going to bring in different people who have different strengths or different expertise, and then they'll kind of weigh in with their expertise. But you don't want too many, like you don't want 3 people that are stats experts, because that's not a good use of resources. But like you might want to, you know what I mean? So I usually go based on colleagues I've worked with who I've enjoyed working with and I know have expertise in a certain thing, superstars who may never email you back, but they might, and then you have them on your advisory board, which also can be great for networking purposes. Or I rely on recommendations from other people, like I'll ask around. So those are usually the 3 ways that I assembled my Avengers. Oh yeah, interesting. It absolutely could be a community advisory board. So actually a big part of what we do is just like we do like implementation science, and so we have people that work with, you know, community stakeholders. So like the food bank. So I work at the BU Medical Campus is a Boston Medical Center in the South End, where Boston Healthcare for the Homeless is, and there's lots of food banks, homeless shelters, etc. And we certainly consult with the stakeholders from those organizations, because we want to know, are our residents referring patients to the resources? Are they like also things? So I think it absolutely could be a community advisory board. I will say if the concern is bias in the research or evaluation, then it might behoove you to have at least one methods person just to kind of check you. So like if it's like, oh, like just someone there who knows enough about research methods that they can identify if something seems biased, just because it can be helpful to have those fresh methodological eyes on what you're doing, but it by no means needs to be made up of methodological experts. No, it's a great question. Yes, I'm gonna, in the resources, I'm gonna send articles and book recommendations. So those will be coming through tomorrow.